Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the hidden chambers of Victorian England, where the most beautiful women in society harboured secrets so dark, so deadly, that their morning beauty rituals could quite literally kill them. Imagine standing before your vanity mirror, reaching for a jar of cream that promises porcelain skin, not knowing that with each application you are painting your own death sentence across your face. This is not fiction. This is the terrifying truth about Victorian beauty, where the price of perfection was measured not in coins, but in years stolen from a woman's life. Now, before we step into this shadowy world together, I would love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like, but only if you genuinely enjoy the stories I bring to you. And I am curious, where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you tucked into bed in New York or perhaps watching the rain in London? Drop a comment below and let me know. I always love hearing from you. All right, dim those lights, let your breathing slow, and let us walk together into the perfumed, poisoned world of Victorian beauty. Picture London in the year 1865. Gas lamps flicker against cobblestone streets. Horse-drawn carriages clatter past townhouses where, behind lace curtains, a young woman named Catherine sits at her dressing table. She's 23 years old, recently married to a wealthy merchant, and tonight she will attend her first grand ball as a married woman. Her maid lays out the tools of transformation: delicate glass bottles, porcelain pots, silver-handled brushes. To our modern eyes, this scene might look romantic, almost magical. But if we could peer into those beautiful containers, we would recoil in horror, because Catherine's path to beauty begins with poison. Let us start with the foundation, quite literally, of Victorian beauty, the obsession with pale skin. But this was not just any paleness. Victorian society demanded a complexion so white, so translucent, that you could see the blue veins beneath, like rivers of sapphire running under fresh snow. Why? The answer lies in the brutal honesty of social hierarchy. If you were pale, it meant you had never worked a day under the sun. It meant you were not a factory girl with sun-damaged hands, not a farmer's wife with weathered cheeks, not a street vendor with a ruddy complexion. Pale skin was a passport, a declaration written across your face that said, "I belong to the world of leisure, of wealth, of power." But here is where our story takes its first dark turn. The women of Victorian England did not simply avoid the sun. They went much, much further. They transformed their skin into what they called the porcelain mask, and they did it using a substance that would make your skin crawl: lead. The product had a beautiful name: Venetian ceruse. It sounds like something from a fairy tale, does it not? But its ingredients were a recipe for slow death. White lead, the same substance used in house paints, mixed with vinegar to create a smooth paste. Women would apply this mixture to their faces, their necks, their arms, anywhere skin would be visible. And oh, it worked beautifully at first. The lead created an impossibly smooth, impossibly white surface. In candlelight, these women looked like living porcelain dolls, their skin luminous and flawless. But lead, you see, is one of nature's most patient killers. It does not strike quickly. It settles into your body, accumulating in your bones, your blood, your brain. And every single day that Catherine applied her lead-based foundation, she was conducting a slow act of self-destruction. Let me tell you what happened to women who used these products regularly. First came the cosmetic problems, which is rather ironic when you think about it. The lead would corrode the skin, creating eruptions, rashes, and discoloration. So what did women do? They applied more lead paint to cover the damage. Can you see the trap? It was a vicious cycle, a spiral that led only downward. The more you used, the worse your skin became. The worse your skin became, the more you needed to use. But the external damage was just the beginning. Lead poisoning, what doctors now call plumbism, attacks your entire system. Women began to experience hair loss. Their lustrous curls, another prized feature of Victorian beauty, would fall out in clumps. Their teeth would decay and fall from their mouths. Some experienced muscle paralysis, their hands shaking uncontrollably, their movements becoming jerky and uncertain. Others suffered cognitive decline, their sharp minds growing foggy and confused. And then there was the pain. Oh, the pain. Lead poisoning causes excruciating abdominal cramps, what doctors of the era called painter's colic, because painters who worked with lead-based paints suffered the same fate. Imagine doubling over in agony, not understanding that your beauty routine was the culprit. Many women died, their deaths recorded as mysterious illnesses or nervous disorders, when in truth they'd been poisoned by their own vanity mirrors. Now, I want to tell you about the most famous victim of this practice, though her story is debated by historians. Queen Elizabeth I, that magnificent, powerful monarch who ruled England for 45 years, was known for her distinctive appearance. Her face was famously white, painted thick with ceruse. As she aged, she applied more and more, reportedly layering it an inch thick to cover the ravages of smallpox scars from her youth. Some historians believe that Elizabeth's notorious temper, her mood swings, her eventual decline, all of these were symptoms of lead poisoning. In the months before her death at age 69, she refused food and drink, perhaps because her damaged digestive system could no longer tolerate them. She simply wasted away. While we cannot know for certain that lead killed her, we do know she used it daily for decades, and we know what lead does to the human body. But it was not just the wealthy who suffered. Think about the women who made these products. In dim workshops and cramped factories, working-class women mixed the lead compounds, breathing in the toxic dust, their hands raw and blistered from the chemicals. They died younger and in greater numbers than the society ladies who bought their wares. This is a thread we will see throughout our story tonight. The people who created beauty products suffered more than those who used them. Now let me introduce you to another product, one with an even prettier name, Liquid Pearl. It promised to give skin a lustrous, pearlescent glow. Can you guess what it contained? If you said lead, you would be absolutely correct. These products were sold in beautiful bottles, displayed in elegant shops, recommended by advice columnists in ladies' magazines. No one mentioned the poison, but some women took this obsession with paleness to an extreme that defies belief. In the region of Bohemia, in what we now call the Czech Republic and Slovakia, there were hot springs naturally contaminated with arsenic. Yes, arsenic, one of history's most famous poisons. And women would travel to these springs to bathe in them, immersing their entire bodies in arsenic-laced water, believing it would lighten their skin from head to toe. They knew arsenic was dangerous. It was commonly used as rat poison after all. But the desire for pale skin overruled common sense. Here is what I find most haunting about this story. These women were not ignorant. By the mid-1800s, doctors were publishing warnings about lead cosmetics. Articles appeared in medical journals detailing the dangers, but the warnings were largely ignored. Why? Because the social pressure to be beautiful, to be pale, to fit the ideal was stronger than the fear of death. Because beauty was currency in a world where women had few other ways to gain power or security. Because a good marriage required beauty, and a good marriage meant survival. I want you to think about Catherine again, sitting at her dressing table. She has read the warnings. She knows there is risk. But tonight's ball could determine her entire social standing. The right connections could secure her husband's business deals. The wrong impression could doom her to social obscurity. So she dips her fingers into the lead-based cream, and she paints her face white, and she makes a choice that countless women made before and after her. She chooses the risk. There is something profoundly tragic about this choice, but also something deeply human. We're all Catherine, in our own ways. We all make small bargains with our health, our time, our well-being, in pursuit of something we've been taught to value. The Victorians just made these bargains with more obviously deadly tools. The porcelain mask of Victorian England was not just a beauty trend. It was a symbol of how societal pressure can override self-preservation, how the pursuit of an ideal can become a form of slow suicide. And the cruelest irony, the damage caused by lead made women's skin worse, creating the exact problems they were trying to hide, trapping them in an ever-tightening spiral of dependency on the very thing that was destroying them. As I close this first chapter of our journey tonight, I want you to hold on to that image. Catherine, standing before her mirror, her face painted white with poison, beautiful and doomed in equal measure, because her story is just the beginning. The porcelain mask was only the foundation. On top of it, Victorian women would layer even more deadly substances, each one promising beauty, each one exacting a terrible price. But those other poisons, those other secrets, well, they are waiting for us in the shadows just ahead. And trust me, what we've uncovered tonight is tame compared to what is coming. Because if you thought painting your face with lead was shocking, wait until you hear about the women who ate poison for breakfast, who believed that slow death by arsenic was a small price to pay for bright eyes and glowing skin. That story, that dangerous ritual is calling to us now, and we must answer. So take a breath. Let your mind settle into this strange, sad world we're exploring, and when you are ready, we will continue our journey into the next deadly secret that Victorian beauties hid beneath their silk and lace. The lead-painted faces we just explored were shocking enough, but what I am about to tell you might be even harder to believe, because while some Victorian women painted poison on their skin, others actually consumed it. Yes, you heard me correctly. They ate poison every single day, on purpose. Welcome to the world of the arsenic eaters, where breakfast might include tea, toast, and a small wafer of one of history's most notorious toxins. I know what you're thinking right now. Arsenic. The same arsenic used to murder people in countless Victorian mystery novels. The same substance that has been a weapon of choice for poisoners throughout history. Yes, exactly that arsenic. And before you dismiss this as the behavior of a few eccentric individuals, let me tell you, this was a widespread practice, supported by doctors, advertised in newspapers, and considered by many to be perfectly safe. In fact, it was marketed as a beauty vitamin. Let me take you to Vienna in the 1870s, to a small apothecary shop where a well-dressed woman approaches the counter. She does not skulk in shame. No, she walks in confidently, because what she is purchasing is legal, socially acceptable, and recommended by beauty experts of her time. She asked the shopkeeper for a box of Dr. Campbell's arsenic complexion wafers. The box is elegant, decorated with images of beautiful women with flawless skin. The label promises results that sound too good to be true. Removal of freckles, blackheads, pimples, vulgar redness, yellow or muddy skins, and other facial disfigurements. Now here is the part that should make your skin crawl. The advertisement actually states, and I am not making this up, that these wafers are absolutely safe and harmless to anybody. This claim was made by Dr. James P. Campbell in 1890. 1890. This was not the Dark Ages. This was an era of scientific advancement, of medical breakthroughs, of growing understanding about chemistry and the human body. And yet, a doctor was selling arsenic as a beauty product and calling it safe. But to understand why anyone would willingly consume poison, we need to travel further east to a mountainous region called Styria, now part of Austria. This is where the practice originated, and the story is absolutely fascinating. The people of Styria lived in high-altitude mountain villages where life was harsh and physically demanding. They discovered that consuming small amounts of arsenic seemed to help them endure the thin mountain air. It gave them stamina, improved their breathing at high elevations, and, as a side effect, it made their skin look extraordinarily clear and pale. Here is how it worked, from a chemical standpoint. Arsenic is a poison that destroys red blood cells. Now you might think that sounds terrible, and you would be right, but the destruction of red blood cells creates a very specific appearance. A pale, almost translucent quality to the skin, combined with a certain brightness to the eyes. The people of Styria did not understand the mechanism, but they saw the results, and word spread. By the mid-1800s, arsenic eating had become fashionable across Europe, particularly in England and France. But there was a catch, a terrible, dangerous catch. Arsenic is what we call a cumulative poison. It builds up in your body over time, stored in your bones, your hair, your fingernails. And it is also, and this is the truly insidious part, physically addictive. Let me explain how women became trapped in this deadly cycle. You would start with a tiny amount, perhaps the size of a grain of rice. At this dose you might experience mild nausea, perhaps a headache, but nothing severe. Your body would begin to build a tolerance, so the next day you would take a slightly larger dose, and then slightly larger still. This gradual increase was necessary because if you suddenly stopped taking arsenic after your body had adapted to it, you would experience horrific withdrawal symptoms, violent vomiting, excruciating abdominal pain, severe diarrhea, and convulsions. Some women died from arsenic withdrawal. So you see the trap? Once you started, stopping could kill you, but continuing would also kill you, just more slowly. It was a choice between immediate agonizing death and slow, creeping death. Most women chose the latter, hoping against hope that somehow they would be the exception, that they would be able to use arsenic safely. And for a while, it seemed to work. Women who took arsenic complexion wafers reported that their skin did indeed become clearer, more luminous. Their eyes seemed brighter. They attributed these changes to the purifying effects of arsenic, not understanding that they were seeing the results of their red blood cells being systematically destroyed. They were essentially making themselves mildly anemic and mistaking illness for beauty. But arsenic had other effects that beauty advertisements conveniently fail to mention. Let me paint you a picture of what long-term arsenic consumption actually does to a human body, because it is important that you understand the full horror of this practice. First, your nervous system begins to deteriorate. Women experience numbness and tingling in their hands and feet, a condition called peripheral neuropathy. Some lost the ability to feel temperature or pain in their extremities, leading to accidental burns and injuries. Others developed tremors, their hands shaking uncontrollably, making simple tasks like writing or sewing impossible. Then there was the damage to internal organs. Arsenic is particularly devastating to the kidneys. Women would develop kidney disease, their bodies slowly losing the ability to filter toxins from their blood. Ironically, the very organ responsible for eliminating poisons from the body was destroyed by the poison they were voluntarily consuming. The liver, that magnificent chemical factory of the human body, would also suffer damage, leading to jaundice, abdominal swelling, and eventually liver failure. But perhaps the cruelest irony of all was this. Arsenic caused the exact skin problems women were trying to solve. After prolonged use, women would develop what doctors called arsenical keratosis, which are rough, scaly patches on the skin, particularly on the palms of the hands and soles of the feet. They would also develop hyperpigmentation, dark spots and patches on their skin, especially in areas exposed to sunlight. Some women experienced vitiligo, a condition where patches of skin lose all pigmentation, creating a blotchy, uneven appearance. So the women who took arsenic to achieve clear, flawless skin ended up with skin conditions far worse than the freckles and blemishes they were trying to eliminate. And what did they do? Many of them increased their arsenic dose, believing they just needed more to achieve the desired effect. Others turned to the lead-based cosmetics we discussed earlier to cover up the damage. It was a nightmare of compounding poisons, each one making the situation worse. Now, I want to share with you a specific historical case that breaks my heart every time I think about it. Though individual names were rarely recorded due to the shame associated with beauty product deaths, medical journals from the late 1800s are filled with case studies of complexion wafer poisoning. One case from an 1892 British medical journal describes a woman in her 20s who'd been taking arsenic wafers for approximately 3 years. She had started with 1 wafer per day, gradually increasing to 6 wafers daily. When she tried to stop, she experienced such severe withdrawal symptoms that she resumed taking them. Eventually, she developed severe arsenical keratosis on her hands and feet, lost most of her hair, and suffered from chronic abdominal pain. She died at age 27 from kidney failure, her beautiful complexion long since destroyed by the very substance she had hoped would preserve it. Think about that for a moment. 27 years old, an entire life ahead of her, stolen by the pursuit of beauty, and she was far from alone. Medical examiners of the era estimated that hundreds, possibly thousands of women died from arsenic poisoning related to beauty products in the Victorian era, though exact numbers are impossible to determine because many deaths were attributed to other causes. You might be wondering, did nobody try to stop this? Were there no voices of reason? Actually, there were. Some doctors and chemists spoke out against arsenic cosmetics. Articles appeared in medical journals warning of the dangers, but these warnings were drowned out by the much louder voice of advertising and social pressure. The beauty industry, even in the Victorian era, was a powerful force. Companies making arsenic products had money, influence, and a vested interest in convincing women their products were safe. And there was another factor at play, one that we see repeated throughout history. People want to believe in magic solutions. They want to believe there is a simple answer to complex problems. Victorian women lived in a society that judged them almost entirely on their appearance and their ability to make a good marriage. Beauty was not just desirable, it was essential for survival. So when someone offered them a product that promised to make them beautiful, they wanted desperately to believe it would work, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. There is also something deeply human about the way these women rationalized their choices. They would say things like, "Well, I only take a small amount," or "I know someone who has been taking it for years with no problems," or "The symptoms I am experiencing must be from something else." This is what psychologists now call confirmation bias. We see what we want to see, and ignore evidence that contradicts our desired beliefs. But let me tell you about one of the most disturbing aspects of the arsenic beauty trend. The people who profited from it knew it was dangerous. By the late 1800s, arsenic's toxicity was well established. It was widely known as a poison used by murderers. The famous poisoners of the Victorian era, women like Mary Ann Cotton, who killed multiple husbands and children with arsenic, were headline news. Everyone knew arsenic could kill, and yet companies continued to manufacture and sell arsenic beauty products, and doctors continued to endorse them because there was simply too much money to be made. Dr. Campbell's arsenic complexion wafers were sold not just in specialty shops, but through mail-order catalogues, making them available to women across America and Europe. The advertising was sophisticated and persuasive, featuring testimonials from satisfied customers and endorsements from doctors. Some advertisements even included before and after illustrations, showing women transformed from plain to beautiful through the magic of arsenic. And here is something that might surprise you. The practice of consuming arsenic for beauty did not end with the Victorian era. Arsenic-based beauty products were still being sold in some countries well into the 1920s and 1930s. It took decades of medical evidence and eventually government regulation to finally remove arsenic from the cosmetics market. Even today, there are parts of the world where skin-lightening products containing toxic substances, including arsenic and mercury, are still sold illegally. I want you to think about what this says about human nature, about our relationship with beauty, about the risks we're willing to take. These Victorian women were not stupid or ignorant. They were making calculated risks, weighing their chances of finding a good marriage against the potential health consequences, in a society where women had few options for economic independence, where beauty could literally mean the difference between prosperity and poverty. Eating a little poison each day might have seemed like a reasonable gamble. But it was not just the immediate users who suffered. Think about the women who worked in factories manufacturing these arsenic wafers. They were exposed to concentrated arsenic dust day after day, breathing it in, absorbing it through their skin. They died in far greater numbers than the wealthy women who purchased their products. This is a pattern we will see again and again in our journey tonight. The working class paying with their lives so that the upper class could pursue an ideal of beauty. The story of arsenic eaters is a story about desperation and delusion, about the power of social pressure and the weakness of human judgment. It is about how we can rationalize almost anything if the alternative seems worse. Those Victorian women, sitting at their breakfast tables, carefully breaking off a piece of arsenic wafer and swallowing it down with their tea, they genuinely believed they were making themselves more beautiful. They could not see, or chose not to see, that they were swallowing death itself. As we prepare to move forward in our exploration of Victorian beauty secrets, I want you to remember the arsenic eaters. Remember how they convinced themselves that poison was medicine, that destruction was improvement. Because this pattern of self-delusion, this willingness to harm ourselves in pursuit of an ideal, it did not end with arsenic wafers. In fact, we have barely scratched the surface of the dangerous lengths Victorian women would go to for beauty. Because while some women were eating poison, others were putting it directly into their eyes, and the reason why will both fascinate and horrify you. The quest for the perfect gaze, for eyes that could captivate and enchant, led to practices so dangerous that many women paid for their vanity with their sight. That story is waiting for us now, dark and compelling, and I think you will find it impossible to look away. They say the eyes are windows to the soul, but for Victorian women, they were also weapons of seduction, tools of social advancement, and, in a twist that seems almost impossible to believe, targets for one of the most dangerous beauty practices ever conceived. Because if you thought eating arsenic was extreme, wait until you hear what women were willing to drop directly into their eyes. Imagine this. You're getting ready for an evening at the opera. Your dress is exquisite. Your hair is perfectly arranged. Your skin has that coveted pale glow. But something is missing. Your eyes, while pretty enough, lack that certain something, that captivating quality that makes people unable to look away. So you reach for a small glass vial on your dressing table. Inside is a clear liquid extracted from one of nature's most deadly plants. And without hesitation, you tilt your head back and let several drops fall directly onto your eyeballs. The plant is called Atropa belladonna. You might know it by its more sinister name, deadly nightshade. Now, before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Have you ever accidentally gotten soap in your eyes? Or maybe a bit of shampoo? Remember how much that burned, how your eyes watered uncontrollably, how you had to immediately flush them with water. Well, imagine voluntarily putting something far more irritating into your eyes, something that does not just sting but fundamentally alters the chemistry of your vision. That is what we're talking about here. The name belladonna itself is rather beautiful, is it not? It is Italian, meaning beautiful woman. And there is a reason for this seemingly gentle name given to such a lethal plant. The practice began in Renaissance Italy, specifically in Venice, where the courtly ladies discovered that drops made from belladonna berries had a very particular effect. They made the pupils of the eyes dilate dramatically, creating a wide-eyed, doe-like appearance that was considered incredibly alluring. There is actually a painting that captures this moment in history. It hangs in the Louvre Museum in Paris, created by the Renaissance master Titian. It is called Woman with a Mirror, and it shows a young Venetian woman, beautiful and fashionable, who may very well have used belladonna drops to achieve her captivating gaze. When you look into her painted eyes, you can almost see that unnatural dilation, that hypnotic quality that belladonna created. But let us talk about what was actually happening inside the eyes of women who used these drops, because the science is both fascinating and terrifying. Belladonna contains several powerful chemicals, the most significant being atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine. These are what scientists call anticholinergics, which is a fancy way of saying they block certain signals in your nervous system. Specifically, they paralyze the muscles that normally constrict your pupils in response to light. Under normal circumstances, your pupils are constantly adjusting, getting smaller in bright light and larger in darkness. This is an automatic reflex, one you never have to think about. But when you put belladonna in your eyes, you override this natural process. Your pupils become locked in a dilated position, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. And yes, this did make women's eyes look larger and more striking. In candlelight and gaslight, the soft illumination of Victorian evenings, these huge dark pupils created an almost mesmerizing effect. Men described women with belladonna dilated eyes as having a dreamy or enchanting quality, as if they were seeing visions beyond the mortal world. Which in a way they were, but not in the romantic sense these men imagined. Because here is what nobody talked about at the dinner parties and balls. Women who used belladonna could barely see. When your pupils are forcibly dilated, you cannot focus properly. Everything becomes blurry, especially at close range. Bright lights become painful, almost unbearable. One medical text from 1873 describes a woman attending a ball after using belladonna drops. She could not read the dance card in her hand. She could not clearly see the faces of the men asking her to dance. She stumbled going downstairs because she could not judge distances accurately. But apparently she looked absolutely stunning, so I suppose she considered it a fair trade. The temporary effects were bad enough, but prolonged use of belladonna led to something far more sinister: permanent blindness. Let me share with you what medical records from the Victorian and Edwardian eras reveal. Ophthalmologists, that is what we call eye doctors, reported case after case of young women presenting with severely damaged vision. Some had developed chronic blurriness that never fully resolved. Others experienced ongoing sensitivity to light so severe they had to live in darkened rooms. And yes, some went completely blind, their vision stolen by their pursuit of beautiful eyes. There is a particularly heartbreaking account from a British medical journal dated 1892. A woman in her early 30s, described only as a lady of good family, had been using belladonna drops regularly for approximately 7 years. She began noticing problems with her vision around year 5, but continued using the drops because she felt they made her more attractive. By the time she finally sought medical help, the damage was irreversible. She could no longer read, could barely distinguish faces, and lived the rest of her life in a sort of perpetual fog, her world reduced to blurry shapes and shadows. Now, you might be thinking, surely not everyone used belladonna. Surely there were safer alternatives. And you would be right to think that. There were alternatives. Unfortunately, they were almost as bad. Some women use citrus juice, squeezing lemon or orange directly into their eyes. Yes, you read that right. Citrus juice. In their eyes. Can you even imagine? I accidentally splashed lemon juice near my eye once while cooking, and just the tiniest droplet on my eyelid made me want to cry. These women were deliberately squirting citric acid directly onto their eyeballs. The theory was that the intense irritation would cause the eyes to water profusely, creating a glistening, dewy look that was considered attractive. And yes, it also caused some pupil dilation, though not as dramatically as belladonna. The pain must have been extraordinary. Citric acid burns the delicate tissues of the eye, causing inflammation, redness, and temporary vision problems. Some women did this daily. Daily! Every morning they would face the mirror and voluntarily torture themselves in the name of beauty. And before you judge them too harshly, remember that they were living in a society that offered women very few paths to security and success. Beauty was one of the only currencies they had. What strikes me most about the belladonna story is how long this practice continued despite overwhelming evidence of its dangers. The plant's name includes the word deadly in most languages. Deadly nightshade. That is not subtle. This was not hidden information. Everyone knew that eating belladonna berries could kill you. There are records of children dying from eating just 2 or 3 of the sweet-tasting berries. The poisonous nature of this plant was common knowledge, yet still beauty advice columns in magazines recommended it. Still, mothers passed the practice down to daughters. I found a reference in a women's magazine from the Edwardian period, that is the early 1900s, where the columnist casually mentions that belladonna drops, while somewhat uncomfortable, do create a most pleasing effect for evening entertainments. Somewhat uncomfortable. That is like describing a hurricane as a bit breezy. And here is something that will really make you shake your head. We still use belladonna in medicine today. Eye doctors use atropine drops to dilate your pupils for eye examinations. But, and this is crucial, they use precisely measured doses, administered by trained professionals in a controlled medical setting. And even then they warn you that your vision will be blurry for hours and you should not drive. Victorian women were doing this to themselves at home, with no medical supervision, using drops of unknown and uncontrolled concentration. The symptoms of belladonna poisoning extend far beyond just vision problems. Let me paint you a complete picture, because it is important to understand just how dangerous this practice was. When you absorb belladonna through your eyes, the chemicals enter your bloodstream. From there, they affect your entire body. Your heart rate increases, sometimes dangerously so. Your mouth becomes incredibly dry, your throat parched. You may experience severe headaches, dizziness, and confusion. Some women had hallucinations, seeing things that were not there, hearing voices. In high doses, belladonna causes delirium, convulsions, and death. There is a reason this plant has such a dark reputation in folklore and literature. It is associated with witches and poisoners throughout European history. In medieval times, it was believed that witches used belladonna in their flying ointments, mixtures that supposedly allowed them to fly through the night sky. In reality, the hallucinations caused by belladonna likely made them feel like they were flying. Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's tragic lovers, are believed by many scholars to have died from belladonna poisoning, based on the symptoms described in the play. So Victorian women were using a substance associated with witchcraft and tragic death to make themselves more attractive for social events. The cognitive dissonance is staggering, is it not? But I want to talk about something that often gets overlooked in discussions of Victorian beauty practices, the class dimension. Because while wealthy women were using belladonna drops purchased from expensive apothecaries, working-class women often could not afford such luxuries. Instead, they might use homemade versions, which were even more dangerous because the concentration could vary wildly. Or they would use the citrus juice method, which was cheaper but painful. And then there were the women who made these products. Imagine working in a factory where your job is to extract chemicals from deadly nightshade plants. You're handling these toxic plants day after day, crushing the berries, processing the leaves. The dust gets in your eyes, on your skin. You breathe it in. These working women suffered all the toxic effects without even the supposed benefit of enhanced beauty. They were just trying to earn enough money to survive. This brings us to a question that has been haunting me as I researched this topic. Why did women continue using belladonna even after they started experiencing problems? Even after their vision began to blur, even after the headaches started, even after friends and family members went blind? And I think the answer lies in something deeper than simple vanity. These women were trapped in a system that valued them primarily for their appearance. Marriage was essentially the only career path available to most women, and to secure a good marriage, you needed to be beautiful. Not just pretty, but stunning, memorable, captivating. The competition was fierce, and the consequences of failure were severe. An unmarried woman had few options and little respect in Victorian society. So when the choice was between risking your eyesight and risking your entire future, many women chose to risk their vision. There is also the factor of hope, that very human tendency to believe that bad things happen to other people, not to us. Every woman who used belladonna probably knew someone who had experienced problems from it. But they told themselves, that won't happen to me. I am more careful. I use less. My eyes are stronger. We see this same pattern of thinking today with all sorts of risky behaviours. We convince ourselves we are the exception. As the Victorian era progressed into the Edwardian period, some things changed. Medical knowledge advanced. Doctors became more vocal in their warnings against belladonna for cosmetic use. Women's magazines began, very cautiously, to suggest that perhaps permanently damaging your eyesight was not worth the temporary enhancement of beauty. But here is the truly wild part. The practice did not fully die out until well into the 20th century. There are records of women still using belladonna eye drops in the 1920s and even 30s, long after the dangers were comprehensively documented and understood. The desire to have captivating eyes was simply too strong to overcome with mere facts and medical evidence. Today, when your eye doctor dilates your pupils, they're using a safer, controlled version of the same chemical that Victorian women were carelessly dropping into their eyes. The next time you sit in that examination chair and the doctor tells you not to drive for a few hours because your vision will be impaired, think about the women who did this to themselves voluntarily and then went out dancing, unable to see clearly but looking, by the standards of their time, absolutely beautiful. The story of belladonna and Victorian beauty is a story about sacrifice and desperation, about the things we're willing to endure when society tells us our worth depends on our appearance. Those women, blinking through their blurred vision, stumbling slightly as they descended staircases, smiling mysteriously because they could not quite see who they were smiling at, they were paying a terrible price for a moment of admiration. But the eyes were not the only part of the body that Victorian women were willing to sacrifice on the altar of beauty. Because while some were blinding themselves drop by drop, others were slowly going mad, their brains deteriorating under the assault of a different poison altogether, a poison that was everywhere, in their makeup, in their medicine, in the very industries that clothed and adorned them. Mercury, that silvery, deadly metal, was about to claim its own victims, and the story of how and why will reveal yet another dark layer of Victorian vanity. There is a phrase you've probably heard before, mad as a hatter. It conjures up images of Lewis Carroll's whimsical character from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, that eccentric fellow hosting an endless tea party. But I need to tell you something that will change how you think about that phrase forever. It was not whimsy. It was not fantasy. It was a medical diagnosis. The Mad Hatter was based on a real phenomenon, a terrible occupational disease caused by a substance so toxic that it could literally drive you insane. That substance was mercury, and its role in Victorian beauty and fashion created a trail of madness and death that stretched across 2 continents. Mercury is a strange element, is it not? It is the only metal that is liquid at room temperature, flowing like silver water, mesmerizing to watch. The ancient alchemists called it quicksilver, believing it held magical properties. They were wrong about the magic, but they were right about one thing: mercury is profoundly dangerous. And yet Victorian society put it everywhere, in medicine, in industry, in cosmetics, especially in cosmetics. Let me take you to London in 1878, to the pages of Harper's Bazaar, one of the most influential fashion magazines of the era. There is a column called The Ugly Girl Papers, or Hints for the Toilet. I know, the title alone is rather brutal, is it not? Imagine opening a magazine today and seeing a column called Advice for Ugly Women. The Victorian era was not known for its gentle approach to self-esteem. Anyway, in this column, the advice columnist, a woman writing under the name of Mrs. S.D. Powers, recommends a product for women troubled by blemishes and acne. The product is bichloride of mercury, and the way she describes it is almost darkly comedic if it were not so tragic. She essentially says it will kill blemishes if it doesn't kill you first. Now you might think she was joking, using hyperbole to make a point, but no, she was being quite literal. Bichloride of mercury is extraordinarily toxic, and yes, it could indeed kill you. But killing blemishes was just one of mercury's supposed beauty applications. Victorian women were also told to use mercury-based ointments on their eyelids to restore lost eyelashes. The recommended mixture, according to an 1874 edition of the same column, was ointment of nitric oxide of mercury mixed with lard. Let that sink in for a moment. They were telling women to rub a mixture of mercury and pig fat onto their eyelids, nightly. Can you imagine following this advice today? Mercury was also a key ingredient in what was called vermilion, a brilliant red pigment used for lip tint and blush. The chemical name is mercury sulfide, and it created the most stunning, vibrant red imaginable. In candlelight, lips painted with vermilion seemed to glow with an almost supernatural intensity. It was the red that every woman wanted, the red that said passion, health, vitality, the red that slowly poisoned everyone who wore it. But here is where our story takes an even darker turn, because the women applying mercury to their faces were not the ones who suffered most. To understand the full tragedy of mercury, we need to leave the drawing rooms and boudoirs of Victorian ladies and travel to the workshops where their beauty was manufactured. We need to talk about the hatters. In the 18th and 19th centuries, men's felt hats were all the rage, and the finest felt was made from rabbit and hare fur. But there was a problem. Rabbit fur does not naturally stick together well enough to form the dense, smooth felt required for quality hats. So hat makers discovered a solution. They would brush the fur with a solution of mercury nitrate. This chemical treatment, called carroting because it turned the fur slightly orange, made the fibers mat together beautifully. Now, if you are already cringing good, you should be. Because the process of making hats involved workers spending 8, 10, 12 hours a day in small, poorly ventilated workshops, breathing in mercury vapors as they brushed and shaped the felt. Day after day, year after year, mercury accumulated in their bodies, particularly in their brains. The first symptoms were subtle. A fine tremor in the hands, so slight that workers might not even notice it at first. This tremor had a specific name in the hat-making communities. In Danbury, Connecticut, which was a major center of American hat production, they called it the Danbury Shakes. In England, it was simply Hatters' Shakes. Workers would find themselves unable to hold a teacup steady or write their own names clearly. But the tremors were just the beginning. As mercury continued to accumulate in the brain, the neurological effects became more severe and more disturbing. Hatters developed what doctors now call erethism, a constellation of psychiatric symptoms that essentially meant the mercury was destroying their minds. Let me describe what erethism looks like, because it is genuinely heartbreaking. First came personality changes. Men who had been cheerful and sociable became withdrawn and suspicious. They lost confidence in themselves, becoming timid and anxious. Many developed severe depression, but perhaps most notably, they became irritable and prone to sudden, irrational outbursts of anger. Imagine your personality, the very essence of who you are, slowly being altered by toxic metal accumulating in your brain tissue. Then came the cognitive decline, memory loss, confusion, difficulty concentrating. Some hatters developed what witnesses described as a sort of emotional instability, where they would laugh or cry inappropriately, unable to control their emotional responses. In severe cases, they experienced full-blown delirium with hallucinations and delusions. And the physical symptoms got worse too. The tremors spread from the hands to the entire body. Hatters would develop slurred speech, difficulty walking, loss of coordination. They looked drunk, stumbling and mumbling, but they were completely sober. They were simply being destroyed from the inside out by mercury poisoning. Here is the truly tragic part. This was an accepted occupational hazard. Everyone in the hat-making industry knew it happened. There are medical reports from as early as the late 1700s documenting the neurological damage suffered by hatters. In 1793, a German physician named Samuel Thomas von Summering studied the effects of mercury on hatters and published detailed findings. The knowledge was there. The evidence was overwhelming. And yet the industry continued using mercury for over a century and a half after these dangers were documented. Why? Because mercury treatment created superior felt. Because changing the manufacturing process would cost money. Because the hatters themselves, who were often poor and had few employment options, could not afford to refuse the work. Let me share with you a specific case that illustrates just how devastating this was. In New Jersey, particularly in the towns of Newark, Orange, and Bloomfield, the hat-making industry boomed in the mid-1800s. A physician from Orange, a Dr. J. Addison Freeman, documented numerous cases of mercury poisoning among local hatters. He described men in their 30s and 40s, men who should have been in the prime of their lives, reduced to shaking, confused shadows of themselves, unable to work, unable to support their families. One case he documented involved a hatter who had worked in the trade for just 8 years. By age 32, the man could no longer perform his job due to severe tremors and memory problems. By 35, he was unable to care for himself. His personality completely transformed, alternating between withdrawn silence and explosive anger. He died at 37, leaving behind a widow and 3 young children with no means of support. Multiply this story by thousands, and you begin to understand the human cost of Victorian fashion. Now, you might be wondering, when did this finally stop? Surely at some point someone put an end to this madness. Well, here is where the story gets even more frustrating. In France, legislation protecting hatters from mercury exposure was passed in 1898. France! They figured it out and did something about it in the 1800s. Britain eventually followed suit, and by the early 20th century, mercury poisoning among British hatters had become relatively rare. But in America continued using mercury in hat production until 1941. 1941! And the reason it finally stopped was not because of worker safety concerns or health regulations. No, it stopped because World War II created a massive demand for mercury to use in manufacturing detonators for bombs. Suddenly, mercury was too valuable to waste on hats. The hatters were finally protected not by compassion or regulation, but by the needs of the war industry. Think about that for a moment. For decades, people knew mercury was causing brain damage and death. But the practice continued because changing it was inconvenient and expensive. It only stopped when mercury became more valuable for killing people in other ways. But let us return to the women, because while hatters were the most visible victims of mercury poisoning, Victorian ladies using mercury cosmetics were suffering too, just more quietly, more privately. The mercury in their lip tints and blushes was absorbed through their skin, entering their bloodstream, accumulating in their organs. The symptoms in women were often attributed to other causes. A woman developing tremors might be diagnosed with hysteria or nervous disorders, terms that Victorian doctors used to explain almost any ailment in women they did not understand. Memory problems, mood swings, irritability. Oh, that is just feminine weakness, the delicate nature of the female constitution. Never mind that she's been applying mercury sulfide to her lips every single day for years. There is a particularly chilling account in a medical journal from 1889 describing a society woman who developed severe neurological symptoms after years of using mercury-based cosmetics. The doctor writing the case study noted that she had an unaccountable tremor of the hands, fits of melancholy, and a progressive dulling of her mental faculties. But because she was a woman of good social standing, and because acknowledging cosmetic use was shameful, the true cause of her illness was never officially recorded. She died at 43, and her death certificate listed brain fever as the cause. but the doctor strongly suspected mercury poisoning. How many other women suffered similar fates, their mercury poisoning disguised under vague diagnoses, their deaths attributed to mysterious feminine ailments? We will never know, because the shame associated with cosmetic use meant these cases were hidden, swept under the rug, never properly documented. And mercury was not just in obvious beauty products, it lurked in unexpected places. Some hair dyes contained mercury compounds. Certain medicinal creams prescribed for skin conditions were mercury-based. Even some of the cold creams that women use daily for moisturizing contained mercury as a preservative. Victorian women could be exposing themselves to mercury from multiple sources simultaneously, none of them properly labeled with warnings. There is also an environmental aspect to this story that often gets overlooked. Mercury does not just poison the person using it, it contaminates the environment. The workshops where mercury was used for hat making released mercury vapors into the air. The wastewater from these facilities loaded with mercury flowed into rivers and streams. The soil around these factories became contaminated. Entire communities were exposed to mercury pollution, not just the workers directly handling it. I find myself thinking about the women who live near hat factories, who breathed air contaminated with mercury vapors every day, who drew their water from mercury-polluted streams. They were not even using beauty products containing mercury, but they were still being poisoned just by proximity to the industry. The story of mercury in Victorian beauty and fashion is a perfect example of how the pursuit of aesthetic perfection created ripples of suffering that extended far beyond the individual user. The society lady applying vermilion to her lips probably never thought about the hatter who went mad making her husband's top hat. The hatter, struggling with tremors and confusion, probably never connected his suffering to the vanity of the upper classes, but they were linked, part of the same toxic system. What makes mercury particularly insidious is its persistence. Unlike some poisons that the body can eventually eliminate, mercury accumulates. It builds up in your tissues over time, stored in your bones, your brain, your kidneys. This means that even small regular exposures can lead to severe poisoning over the years. You cannot undo mercury exposure. Once it is in your body, it is there, doing damage. And here is something that should make you uncomfortable. We still live with the legacy of Victorian mercury use, those contaminated factory sites. Many of them were never properly cleaned up. The mercury they released into the environment is still there, still dangerous, still poisoning soil and water in some locations. These sins of Victorian vanity literally persist in the ground beneath our feet. As we move deeper into the secrets Victorian beauties hid, I want you to keep mercury in mind. Remember the mad hatters, the trembling hands, the destroyed minds. Remember that behind every tube of brilliant red vermilion was a trail of suffering that most users never saw or acknowledged. Because this pattern, this willingness to ignore the human cost of beauty, this disconnect between consumer and consequence, it is about to get even more extreme. Because while some Victorian women were poisoning their faces and eyes, others were systematically deforming their entire bodies, squeezing themselves into contraptions that would reshape their very skeletons. The corset, that iconic symbol of Victorian femininity, was not just uncomfortable. For some women, it was a torture device, and the X-rays that finally revealed what corsets were doing to women's bodies would shock even the doctors who thought they had seen everything. That revelation, and the stubborn refusal of society to change despite the evidence, is waiting for us now. I need to tell you about a woman you can still visit today, though she has been dead for well over a century. Her name was Mrs. Grieve, and she rests in a museum, her body preserved for education and study. But it is not her face that draws visitors, it is her torso. Because when you look at Mrs. Greaves' ribcage, you see something that seems almost impossible, something that makes medical students gasp even now. Her ribs are not arranged in the graceful protective curve that nature intended. Instead, they bend inward at sharp angles, compressed into a shape that looks more like a crushed birdcage than a human skeleton. Mrs. Greaves wore corsets, not just occasionally, but every single day, probably from the age of 10 or younger until the day she died, and her bones tell that story more powerfully than any words ever could. Let us talk about corsets, but not in the way you might expect, because there is a lot of mythology surrounding these garments, a lot of exaggeration and misconception. So I want to be very clear about something from the start. Not all corsets were dangerous. A properly fitted corset, worn at a reasonable tightness, could actually provide back support and was no more harmful than a modern bra. Women of all social classes wore corsets, and most of them lived perfectly normal, healthy lives. But, and this is a crucial but, there was a subset of the corset-wearing population who took things to an extreme that defies comprehension. They practiced something called tight lacing, and tight lacing is where our story becomes truly disturbing. The goal of tight lacing was simple: make your waist as small as physically possible, regardless of the consequences. The ideal measurement, 17 to 19 inches. Let me give you some perspective on how small that is. 17 inches is about 43 centimeters. That is approximately the circumference of a basketball. Now think about your own waist for a moment, or look at someone near you. The average woman's waist today is around 32 to 35 inches. Victorian tight laces were trying to achieve a waist measurement that was less than half of what we consider normal now. How did they do it? Through a process so gradual, so methodical, that it is almost like a form of self-sculpture. And it started young, shockingly young. Imagine you're a Victorian girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old. Your mother decides it is time for you to begin wearing a corset. This is not presented as optional. This is part of becoming a proper young lady, as essential as learning to read or embroider. Your first corset is relatively gentle, but each year as you grow, your corsets become progressively more structured, more restrictive. By the time you reach adolescence, you're being laced tighter and tighter, your body literally being molded into the desired shape while your bones are still soft and malleable. Some mothers, particularly ambitious ones, would have their daughters sleep in their corsets every single night. Can you imagine that? Going to bed in a rigid cage that prevents you from taking a deep breath, from rolling over comfortably, from resting in any natural position. But the logic was clear. If you only wore your corset during the day, your body would expand back to its natural shape each night. To achieve a truly tiny waist, you needed constant, unrelenting pressure. Now, here is where we get to the technological development that made extreme tight lacing possible, the invention of the metal eyelet in the 1820s and 1830s. Before metal eyelets, corset laces were threaded through holes in the fabric, and there was a limit to how tightly you could pull before the fabric would simply tear. But metal eyelets changed everything. They could withstand tremendous force without giving way. Suddenly you could lace a corset brutally tight, cinching it with strength that would have destroyed earlier designs, and women did. Oh, they absolutely did. There are accounts of women having their maids place a foot against their backs for leverage, while pulling the laces as tight as humanly possible. Some women had their husbands do the lacing, treating it almost like a competitive sport to see how many inches could be shaved away. but what was actually happening inside these women's bodies. Let me walk you through it, organ by organ, because the reality is far worse than most people understand. Let us start with the rib cage. Your ribs are designed to protect your vital organs and expand when you breathe. They are curved bones connected to your spine at the back and, for most of them, to your breastbone at the front. Under normal circumstances, they maintain a gentle, rounded shape, but sustained pressure from tight lacing literally bent these bones. Not overnight, of course, but year after year of constriction, especially during the growing years, the ribs would slowly deform, bending inward at unnatural angles, some of them overlapping each other. In 1908, a French doctor named Ludovico Followill published a book that would shock the medical community. It was called Le Corset, and it contained something that had never been seen before: X-ray photographs of women in their corsets. X-ray technology was still relatively new, and these images revealed for the first time what was actually happening beneath the fabric and whalebone. The images are still available today, and they are genuinely disturbing. You can see the ribs crushed into S-shaped curves, the spine twisted out of its natural alignment, the entire structure of the upper body distorted beyond recognition. One image shows the rib cage in a normal position overlaid with the rib cage of a tight lacer. The difference is staggering. Where there should be space for organs to function, there is compression, distortion, a complete reorganization of the body's internal architecture. But the bones were just the beginning. Let us talk about what happened to the soft tissue, the organs that had nowhere to go when the rib cage was compressed inward. The liver is your body's largest internal organ, a wedge-shaped powerhouse that sits under your ribs on the right side. It performs hundreds of essential functions, filtering toxins, producing proteins, storing energy. In a tight-laced woman, the liver had no choice but to conform to the new, smaller space available. And it did, in the most disturbing way possible. Medical museums have specimens, actual preserved livers taken from women who died after years of tight lacing. And these livers bear deep grooves, indentations where the ribs pressed into them day after day, year after year. The flesh literally moulded around the bones, creating a permanent record of the violence that had been done to these organs. One physician examining such specimens noted that he could count the ribs by the grooves they had carved into the liver tissue. And if the liver was being crushed upward, something else had to move down. That something was the stomach and the rest of the digestive system. The stomach, normally positioned just beneath the diaphragm, would be forced downward into the abdominal cavity. This displacement caused all sorts of digestive problems. Women who tight-laced frequently experienced what they called dyspepsia, which is essentially chronic indigestion. They had trouble eating full meals because there was simply no room for their stomachs to expand. Many tight lacers ate only small amounts throughout the day, not by choice but by necessity. The intestines, too, were compressed and displaced, leading to chronic constipation, bloating, and abdominal pain. Some women developed what we now know as gastroesophageal reflux, where stomach acid flows back up into the esophagus, causing burning and discomfort. But Victorian doctors did not understand these conditions the way we do now. They just knew that fashionable women seemed to suffer from mysterious stomach ailments at alarming rates. Now, let us talk about breathing, because this is where tight lacing became immediately dangerous. Your lungs need space to expand when you inhale. They fill the rib cage, pressing outward against the ribs, pulling in oxygen. But a tight-laced corset prevented this natural expansion. The bottom portions of the lungs in particular could barely move at all. This created what doctors called chronic underperfusion of the lower lungs, Essentially, the bottom parts of the lungs were not getting enough air circulation. And do you know what loves poorly ventilated, stagnant areas of the lung? Bacteria, particularly the bacteria that causes pneumonia. Tight-laced women were significantly more prone to respiratory infections than their less constricted peers. A simple cold that a normal person would shake off in a week could turn into pneumonia for a tight lacer, because her lungs simply did not have the capacity to fight the infection effectively. And pneumonia in the Victorian era, before antibiotics, was often fatal. There is a documented case in The Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious medical journals, from June 1890. The headline reads, "Death from Tight Lacing." It describes a young woman who collapsed and died at a social event. The autopsy revealed that her corset had compressed her ribcage to such an extent that it literally restricted blood flow to her heart. She essentially suffocated from the inside, her organs starved of oxygen because her lungs could not expand enough to take in adequate air. But perhaps the most disturbing consequence of tight lacing involved pregnancy and childbirth. Some Victorian women continued wearing corsets throughout pregnancy, despite doctors' increasingly desperate pleas not to. Why would they do this? Partly because pregnancy was meant to be hidden for as long as possible. A visibly pregnant woman in public was considered somewhat scandalous. Women were expected to retreat from society during the later months of pregnancy, but many wanted to delay that retreat as long as they could, so they would loosen their corsets slightly, but continue wearing them, compressing not just their own organs but the growing child within them. The pressure on the uterus and the developing baby can only be imagined. Some husbands actually complained, according to medical records, that they did not want their baby's head shaped and moulded by corset pressure, which tells you that this was a known concern, a recognized risk, and yet the practice continued. And after childbirth, tight lacing created another problem: uterine prolapse. This is where the uterus literally falls down out of its normal position, sometimes protruding from the body. It happens because childbirth weakens the pelvic floor muscles, and tight corsets increase abdominal pressure, pushing everything downward. For women who had multiple pregnancies, this was an agonizingly common problem. There is a letter I want to share with you, because it really captures the day-to-day reality of living with a corset-damaged body. It was written in 1900 by Emma Thursby, a famous American singer and performer. She wrote to a friend about her experience with what she called the doctor's corset, from a fashionable Parisian shop. She says, and I am paraphrasing here because the original language is quite Victorian, that she wore it for 2 days and it nearly killed her. It upset all her internal organs and made her violently ill. Her doctor told her she should never wear such tight corsets, and she had to order a different, gentler style instead. But even this looser corset cost her 80 francs, which was a considerable sum, and she mentions casually that she needed medical treatment 4 times to help her liver recover from the damage. Think about that. A wealthy, successful woman, someone who could afford the best medical care available, was being injured by her clothing and needed repeated medical intervention. And she talks about it almost as if it were normal, just part of being a fashionable woman. But here is what I find most fascinating and most tragic about the corset story. Medical evidence of harm did almost nothing to stop the practice. Doctors published study after study showing the damage. Medical journals printed horrifying case reports and autopsy findings. Photographs and later X-rays made the skeletal deformities impossible to deny. And yet the fashion continued. In fact, tight lacing reached its absolute peak in the late 1800s and early 1900s, long after the medical evidence was comprehensive and irrefutable. Why? Because fashion and social pressure are more powerful than logic or self-preservation. because the ideal of the tiny waist was so deeply embedded in Victorian culture that rejecting it meant rejecting femininity itself. Because women were told, explicitly and implicitly, that their value lay primarily in their appearance. Because a small waist could mean the difference between a good marriage and spinsterhood, between social acceptance and social death. There was even a shockingly cynical statement published in a magazine in 1846. I want to quote it directly, because it is so revealing of Victorian attitudes. It said, "Tight lacing is a public benefit, for it kills off the foolish girls and leaves the wise ones for good wives and mothers." Read that again. A public benefit. The writer was essentially saying that women stupid enough to tight lace deserved to die, and their deaths would improve the gene pool. This was the level of callousness, the utter disregard for women's well-being that permeated Victorian society. But I do not want to give you the impression that all Victorian women were passive victims. There was resistance, pushback, a growing movement of women and progressive doctors who fought against tight lacing. They published pamphlets, gave lectures, wrote editorials. Dress Reform Society sprang up advocating for healthier clothing. And slowly, very slowly, things began to change. The invention of the bicycle in the late 1800s helped enormously, because you simply cannot ride a bicycle in a tightly laced corset. You need to breathe, to move, to bend. As more women took up cycling, they began demanding looser clothing. World War I delivered the final blow, when women went to work in factories and fields, replacing the men who had gone to war. Corsets became impossible. You cannot operate machinery or do physical labor while compressed in whalebone and steel. By the 1920s, the corset as we know it had essentially disappeared, replaced by lighter, more flexible undergarments. But the legacy remained. Women who had worn tight corsets for decades found that their back muscles had atrophied, weakened from years of being supported by external structures. They could barely hold themselves upright without their corsets. Some experienced severe dizziness when they finally took their corsets off, as blood rushed to areas that had been constricted for so long. As I think about Mrs. Grieve in her museum display, her twisted ribs silent testimony to a lifetime of compression, I am struck by the complexity of this story. Were these women victims? Absolutely. Were they also, in some sense, complicit in their own suffering? Perhaps. But I think that framing misses the point. These women were living in a system that gave them very few options and very little power. Beauty was one of the only currencies they had, so they spent it, even when the cost was their own bodies, their own health, their own lives. They were not foolish. They were desperate. And desperation makes people do things that look, from the outside, utterly irrational. The corset story teaches us something profound about the human capacity for adaptation and self-destruction. It shows us how far people will go when society offers them no alternatives, and it reminds us that the body, for all its apparent solidity, is frighteningly malleable. Given enough time, enough pressure, enough determination, you can reshape a human skeleton. But that does not mean you should. And speaking of things that should never have been done, I need to tell you about a colour. Just a colour, a simple shade of green, that became one of the most fashionable and most deadly elements of Victorian life. This green did not just poison the women who wore it. It poisoned the air they breathed, the rooms they lived in. Even the children who played with toys died in this beautiful, terrible colour. The story of Sheila's green and its more famous cousin, Paris green, is a story of mass poisoning on a scale that almost defies belief, and it is calling to us now from the shadows of Victorian parlours and ballrooms. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the most beautiful shade of green you can imagine. not the dull green of ordinary grass, but something vibrant, alive, almost luminous. A green that seems to glow from within, that catches the light and holds it, that makes you think of springtime and new life and all things fresh and growing. Now open your eyes, because I need to tell you that this exact shade of green, this colour that Victorian society fell absolutely in love with, was killing people by the thousands. The colour had innocent-sounding names. Scheele's green, named after the Swedish chemist who invented it in 1775, and later an even more brilliant version called Paris green, synthesized in 1814. These names sound elegant, sophisticated, almost romantic. But there is another name for these pigments that is far more accurate. Arsenic green. Yes, arsenic again. That same poison we discussed earlier, the one women were eating in wafers to lighten their skin. But this time, the arsenic was everywhere. And I mean everywhere. It was in the wallpaper of your bedroom, the paint on your walls, the fabric of your dress, the ribbons in your hair, the gloves on your hands, the artificial flowers decorating your hat, the draperies framing your windows. It was even in the candies children ate and the toys they played with. Victorian society was literally wrapped in poison, and for decades hardly anyone seemed to notice or care. Let me take you to London in 1861, to a small workshop where young women sit at long tables, their fingers moving quickly as they construct artificial flowers. These are not real flowers, of course. They're made from fabric and wire dyed in brilliant colours to mimic nature. The most popular colour, the one that sells best, the one their employer demands they produce in the greatest quantities, is a stunning emerald green. The workshop is not well ventilated. There are no windows that open, no fresh air circulation, and as these women work, they are surrounded by a fine dust of green powder. It settles on their clothes, their skin, their hair. They breathe it in with every breath. Some of them lick their fingers to help shape the delicate petals. The green gets under their fingernails, into the small cuts and abrasions on their hands. One of these workers is a 19-year-old woman named Matilda Schurer. She's been working in this shop for about 2 years, making green artificial flowers for fashionable ladies to wear on their hats and dresses. And on a particular day in November 1861, Matilda begins to feel unwell. She experiences severe stomach cramps, nausea, vomiting. Her employer sends her home, assuming she has eaten something that disagreed with her. But Matilda does not get better. Over the next few days, her symptoms worsen dramatically. She begins to convulse. Her eyes roll back in her head. Most disturbingly, she begins to vomit a green liquid. Not the normal yellowish bile of typical vomiting, but bright green fluid, the colour of the flowers she's been making. Even her skin takes on a greenish tinge. She dies in agony, and when a doctor examines her body, he finds massive amounts of arsenic in her system. Her hair, her fingernails, her internal organs, all saturated with poison. The doctor estimates that Matilda had absorbed enough arsenic to kill several people, and it had all come from the beautiful green dust in her workshop. Matilda Schurer's death became something of a scandal, reported in newspapers across England. Public awareness began to grow about the dangers of arsenic in dyes and fabrics. But here is the truly shocking part. Even after this well-publicised death, even after doctors and chemists raised alarms, even after the evidence became overwhelming, the use of arsenic green in fashion continued for decades. Why? Because it was the most beautiful green anyone had ever seen. Other green dyes faded quickly, turned muddy or brown with exposure to light, but arsenic green held its colour brilliantly. It was stable, vivid, perfect. and in Victorian colour symbolism, green represented femininity, nature, youth, and innocence. Every fashionable woman wanted to wear it. But let us talk about what arsenic-dyed fabric actually did to the women who wore it. Because unlike eating arsenic wafers, where you knew you were consuming poison, wearing arsenic-dyed clothing felt safe. How could a dress hurt you? The answer lies in a chemical reaction that most Victorians did not understand. Arsenic compounds are not particularly dangerous when they are completely dry and stable, but add moisture and they become volatile. And what is one thing human bodies produce constantly? Moisture, sweat specifically. When a woman wore an arsenic-dyed green dress, her body heat and perspiration would cause the arsenic to leach out of the fabric. In warm weather, or during dancing at a ball when she was sweating more heavily, even more arsenic would be released. It would be absorbed through her skin, entering her bloodstream. And because this was happening slowly, over many hours of wearing the dress, she might not even realize she was being poisoned. The first symptoms were often skin irritation. Women would develop rashes, particularly in areas where the fabric rubbed against skin. The armpits, the waist where the dress was tight, anywhere the fabric was in prolonged contact. These rashes could be severe, with blistering and ulceration. I have read accounts of women developing painful sores under their arms from wearing green silk dresses, the flesh literally eaten away by the arsenic. Gloves were particularly dangerous because hands sweat more than most other body parts, and the gloves fit tightly. There are numerous medical reports of women developing what doctors called glove ulcers, painful lesions on their hands and wrists from wearing arsenic-dyed green gloves. The skin would crack, bleed, become infected. Some women lost fingernails, and yet green gloves remained fashionable. But the dress wearers were not even the primary victims. Once again, it was the workers who suffered most. Let me tell you about the conditions in dye factories and garment workshops where arsenic green was used. The process of dyeing fabric with arsenic compounds created an incredibly toxic environment. Workers would mix powdered arsenic pigments with water and other chemicals, creating a paste that would be applied to fabric. This process generated arsenic-laden steam and dust. The workers breathed this in constantly. Their clothes became saturated with arsenic. When they went home at night, they carried the poison with them, exposing their families. There are heart-wrenching accounts of entire families being poisoned because the father or mother worked in an arsenic dye factory. Children developing skin conditions, stomach problems, neurological issues, all because their parent brought home contaminated clothing. The poison spread like an invisible plague through working-class neighborhoods, and it was not just clothing. Remember, I mentioned wallpaper? This might be the most insidious use of arsenic green because it affected everyone in a household, regardless of whether they wore green dresses. Victorian wallpaper was often decorated with elaborate patterns in brilliant colours, and green was extremely popular. Entire rooms, sometimes entire houses, would be covered in arsenic green wallpaper. The dining room, the parlour, the bedrooms, even children's nurseries. And this wallpaper was literally poisoning the air people breathed. Here is how it worked. Certain types of mould and fungus can grow on wallpaper, especially in damp conditions, which were common in Victorian homes. When these microorganisms interact with arsenic compounds in the wallpaper, they produce a gas called arsine. Arsine is one of the most toxic substances known to humanity. It is colourless. It has a faint garlic-like odour that most people would not even notice, and breathing even small amounts of it can cause severe poisoning. Families would sleep in rooms with arsenic wallpaper, breathing in arsine gas night after night. They would wake up with headaches, nausea, feeling generally unwell, never connecting their symptoms to the beautiful green walls surrounding them. Children, whose smaller bodies and developing systems made them more vulnerable, would sicken and sometimes die. Doctors would diagnose mysterious illnesses, never suspecting that the very walls of the house were the culprit. There is a famous case involving the Napoleon Bonaparte family. Napoleon himself died in 1821 on the island of St. Helena, where he had been exiled. For years, historians debated the cause of his death. Was it stomach cancer, as the official autopsy claimed? Was he murdered by poison, as some conspiracy theories suggested? In the 1980s, scientists analysed samples of Napoleon's hair and found extremely high levels of arsenic. Some researchers then examined the wallpaper from his residence on St. Helena, and guess what they found? Arsenic. Lots of it. The room where Napoleon spent his final years was decorated with green wallpaper containing high concentrations of arsenic compounds. It is entirely possible that Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the most powerful men in European history, was slowly poisoned by his own wallpaper. Now, I want to be clear. There is debate among historians about whether the wallpaper was truly the cause of Napoleon's death, or whether the arsenic in his hair came from other sources. But the fact that this is even a plausible theory tells you something about how dangerous arsenic wallpaper was. And it was not just wallpaper and fabric. Arsenic green was used in house paint, both interior and exterior. It was used to colour printer's ink in books and magazines. It was used in candle wax, making pretty green candles that would release arsenic vapours when burned. It was used to decorate children's toys, including dolls and wooden figures. It was even used to colour candies and confections, creating beautiful green sweets that could poison the children who ate them. Think about that for a moment. A Victorian child could wake up in a room with arsenic wallpaper, play with arsenic-dyed toys, eat arsenic-coloured candy, and wear clothes with arsenic-dyed ribbons, all before lunchtime. The exposure was comprehensive, inescapable, and for the most part, invisible. The British Medical Journal published an article stating that a woman wearing an arsenic-dyed ball gown carries in her skirts poison enough to slay the whole of the admirers she may meet with in half a dozen ballrooms. This was not hyperbole. Chemical analysis of surviving Victorian dresses has found arsenic levels that are genuinely shocking. One dress examined by modern researchers contained enough arsenic to potentially kill multiple people if it were somehow concentrated and ingested. But perhaps the most frustrating aspect of this story is how long it took for meaningful action to happen. The dangers of arsenic dyes were known, published, discussed in medical journals and newspapers from at least the 1850s onward. Yet it was not until the 1870s and 1880s that some countries began to take action. Scandinavia, France, and Germany eventually banned arsenic pigments in certain products. But Britain, the epicenter of Victorian fashion and industry, never issued a comprehensive ban. British manufacturers continued producing arsenic-dyed goods well into the late 1800s. Why? Money. The arsenic dye industry was profitable. Changing to safer alternatives would cost money and reduce profits. So the industry lobbied against restrictions, downplayed the dangers, and continued poisoning their workers and customers. There is a pattern here that we have seen again and again tonight. Economic interests trumping human welfare. The people profiting from dangerous products using their wealth and influence to prevent regulation, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of harm. But eventually the market solved what regulation could not. In the late 1800s, chemists developed synthetic dyes that could produce brilliant colours without arsenic. These aniline dyes, as they were called, were not perfect. They had their own health risks, particularly for the workers who produced them, but they were far less dangerous than arsenic, and crucially, they were cheaper to produce. Once a safer and more economical alternative existed, arsenic dyes fell out of favour relatively quickly. By the early 1900s, they had largely disappeared from the market, not because society suddenly developed a conscience, but because capitalism found a better option. I want you to think about the workers again, because their story is so often overlooked. Matilda Scheurer, who died at 19, was just one of thousands. Entire communities of artificial flower makers, textile workers, dye factory employees, wallpaper manufacturers, all of them exposed to massive amounts of arsenic, all of them dying young, their deaths rarely recorded or mourned by the society that benefited from their labour. There is a profound injustice in the fact that wealthy women worried about the slight skin irritation from wearing green dresses, while the women who made those dresses were dying of arsenic poisoning. The consumer experienced minor discomfort. The worker experienced death. And Victorian society seemed to consider this an acceptable arrangement. As we move forward through the remaining secrets of Victorian beauty, I want you to keep Shields Green in mind. Remember that poison can be beautiful. Remember that entire societies can normalize practices that are objectively insane. Remember that the people who suffer most are rarely the people making the choices, because while some Victorian women were wearing poison, others were painting their faces with it, creating masks so thick, so elaborate that they became living works of art. But these painted ladies, these women who turned their faces into canvases, they were playing with fire in ways that even they did not fully understand. The world of Victorian face painting, of enamelling and heavy cosmetics, is a world of vanity and desperation, of beauty and decay, and it is waiting to reveal its secrets to us now. There hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art a painting that has captivated and disturbed viewers for over a century. It is called Madame X, painted by John Singer Sargent in 1884, and it depicts a woman who became one of the most controversial figures in Parisian society. Her name was Virginie Amélie Avegno-Gautreau, though history remembers her simply as Madame X. And the most striking thing about this portrait, the detail that makes people stop and stare even today, is her skin. It is not just pale, it is corpse white, deathly, almost luminescent in its pallor. Some viewers have described it as looking like marble, others say porcelain, but the most accurate description might be, it looks like death itself, because that is essentially what Madame X had painted on her face. She was what Victorians called a painted lady, and that term carried very specific connotations that we need to understand. In Victorian society, there were two acceptable approaches to beauty. The first was the natural look, which we have discussed before. Pale skin achieved through avoiding sun and using minimal, carefully hidden cosmetics. This was the respectable choice, the one befitting ladies of good breeding. The second was the painted look, and this was considered scandalous, provocative, associated primarily with actresses and women of questionable virtue. The painted look involved covering your face, neck, and exposed arms with thick, opaque makeup that completely obscured your natural skin tone. It was not subtle, it was not meant to look natural, it was theatrical, artificial, a deliberate transformation that announced, I am a work of art, not a mere woman. And the substance most commonly used to achieve this effect was called enamel. The very word should make you wince, because enamel is what we put on pottery, on metal, on things we want to make hard and impervious. And Victorian women were putting it on their living, breathing skin. The composition of these enamels varied, but most contained some combination of lead, arsenic, and zinc oxide, mixed with oils or waxes to create a paste that could be spread across the skin. When it dried, It formed a hard, smooth surface that was indeed very similar to pottery enamel. Your face became a mask, rigid and unchanging. And here is the crucial detail that makes this practice so bizarre. You could not move your face at all. If you smiled, the enamel would crack. If you frowned, it would crack. If you showed any emotion whatsoever, lines would appear in your carefully constructed facade, revealing the damaged skin beneath. So women who wore enamel had to maintain a completely neutral expression at all times. No laughing, no crying, no raised eyebrows in surprise. You became a beautiful statue, frozen and expressionless. Can you imagine attending a party, a ball, a dinner, and being unable to smile? Unable to show amusement or interest or any of the normal social signals we communicate through facial expressions? It must have been profoundly isolating, trapped behind a mask of your own creation. But Madame X took things even further. According to contemporary accounts, she not only enamelled her face and décolletage white, she also painted blue veins onto her arms with indigo dye, trying to create the illusion of such translucent skin that you could see the veins beneath. She was essentially cosplaying as a corpse, and Parisian society found it both shocking and irresistible. The portrait caused such a scandal when it was first exhibited that Madame X's reputation was nearly destroyed. But the scandal was not about the makeup, interestingly enough. It was about the provocative pose and the fallen shoulder strap of her dress, which Sargent later repainted to be properly in place. The deathly makeup was just accepted as normal for a woman of her type. Now, let us talk about what living as a painted lady actually meant, because the daily reality was far more disturbing than any portrait could capture. Your morning routine would begin hours before you planned to appear in public. First, you would need to thoroughly clean your face, removing any remaining enamel from the previous day or night. This itself was a challenge, because the enamel did not come off easily. It had to be scraped and scrubbed, often damaging the skin in the process. Then you would apply a base layer, sometimes called a foundation, though it bore little resemblance to modern foundation makeup. This base was often made with white lead, the same substance we discussed in our first chapter. Already, you are poisoning yourself, but we are just getting started. Next came the enamel itself, applied with a brush or spatula, spread across your face and down your neck in a thick layer. You had to work quickly before it began to harden. If you made a mistake, if the application was uneven, you would have to remove it all and start over. The process could take an hour or more. Once the enamel was applied, you had to wait for it to dry and harden. During this time, you could not move, could not speak, certainly could not eat or drink. You would sit statue still while the poison hardened on your skin. Some women described a sensation of tightness, of their skin being pulled taut. Others said it burned or tingled. These were signs that the toxic ingredients were being absorbed through their skin, but most women ignored the warnings. After the enamel dried, you might apply additional colours, rouge made from mercury sulfide for the cheeks and lips, perhaps some subtle eye makeup. But you had to be incredibly careful, because any pressure or rubbing could crack the enamel, ruining hours of work. And then you were ready to face the world, or rather, to present your artificial face to the world. But your day of suffering had only just begun. You could not eat normally because chewing would move the muscles of your face and crack the enamel. Some painted ladies would take only liquids through a straw or tiny bites of soft food, eating as little as possible while in public. You could not drink hot beverages because the heat might soften or crack the enamel. You certainly could not laugh, cry, or show any strong emotion. And heaven help you if you started to sweat. Body heat and moisture were the enemies of enamel. On a warm day, or in a crowded ballroom, the enamel might begin to soften, to run, creating a grotesque melting effect. There are accounts of painted ladies having to suddenly leave social events as their faces literally began to melt, streaks of white running down their necks like candle wax. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the long-term damage. Remember, this enamel contained lead, arsenic, and other toxic metals, and it was not a thin layer that was quickly removed. It was thick, applied directly to skin, worn for hours at a time, sometimes even overnight if a woman was attending multiple events or travelling. The skin underneath would become progressively more damaged. The toxic ingredients would cause inflammation, rashes, sores. The skin would dry out, crack, develop lesions. And what did women do when their skin became damaged? They applied more enamel to cover the damage. It was the same vicious cycle we saw with lead makeup, but even more extreme. There is a remarkable quote from a beauty writer of the era named Lola Montez. She was a dancer, courtesan, and self-styled beauty expert who wrote extensively about cosmetics. And even she, someone who was relatively tolerant of vanity and artifice, was absolutely scathing about enamel. She wrote, and I am quoting directly here, "If Satan has ever had any direct agency in inducing woman to spoil or deform her own beauty, it must have been in tempting her to use paints and enameling." Think about that. A woman who made her living partly through her appearance, who understood the pressures to be beautiful, who was not particularly conservative or moralistic, was comparing enamel to the devil's work. That tells you something about how extreme this practice was considered, even by Victorian standards. But Montez's warnings, like so many others, were largely ignored by the women who felt they needed enamel to compete in society. And there was a class element here that we cannot ignore. Painted ladies were often women who existed on the fringes of respectable society. Actresses, courtesans, women who had divorced or been widowed, women trying to maintain their position through beauty because they had no other resources. For these women, the painted look was both a rebellion and a survival strategy. It said, "I refuse to pretend to be naturally beautiful. I am artificial, theatrical, constructed. I am a work of art." But it also said, "I am desperate. I need to be noticed, to be desired, because my survival depends on it." The respectable ladies, the ones with secure positions and good marriages, could afford to pursue the natural look. They had the luxury of subtlety. But women on the margins had to be bold, dramatic, unforgettable, even if it meant slowly poisoning themselves. And here is something that often gets overlooked in discussions of Victorian beauty: the shame and secrecy surrounding cosmetic use. Even painted ladies whose makeup was obvious and intentional would often deny using cosmetics when directly asked. There were elaborate codes and euphemisms. Makeup was referred to as enhancements or embellishments. Buying cosmetics was done through back doors of apothecary shops, never through the front entrance where you might be seen. Women would store their makeup in hidden compartments in their dressing tables. They would repackage commercial cosmetics into plain containers that looked like medicine bottles. So if someone saw them, they could claim it was a prescription from a doctor. The lengths women went to hide their cosmetic use, even when everyone knew they were using cosmetics, speaks to the profound shame of Victorian society attached to artificial beauty. There is an account I find particularly poignant from a Victorian household guide that describes how a lady should behave if she is discovered with cosmetics in her possession. The advice is essentially to claim they belong to a theatrical friend, or that they were purchased out of curiosity but never used, or that a doctor prescribed them for a medical condition. Never, under any circumstances, should a lady admit to using cosmetics for the purpose of improving her appearance. That would be too shameful to acknowledge. So you have this bizarre situation where everyone knows that painted ladies are wearing thick enamel makeup. It is obvious and intentional, but there is still this dance of denial and euphemism, this refusal to speak plainly about what everyone can clearly see. Now, let us talk about what happened to painted ladies as they aged, because the tragedy of the painted look is that it created the very problems it was meant to solve, only worse. The constant application of toxic enamels destroyed the skin. By their 30s or 40s, painted ladies would have skin so damaged that they could not appear in public without their makeup. The skin would be discoloured, scarred, covered in sores and lesions. They were literally dependent on the poison that was killing them, and as their natural skin deteriorated, they needed thicker and thicker layers of enamel to cover the damage. The process became a full-time occupation. Some painted ladies spent 3 or 4 hours every day applying and maintaining their artificial faces. They were prisoners of their own vanity, trapped in a nightmare of their own creation. There are medical case reports from the late 1800s describing the post-mortem examinations of women who had been painted ladies. Their skin tissue showed extreme degradation, saturated with heavy metals. Their internal organs displayed damage consistent with chronic heavy metal poisoning. Some had developed what we would now recognize as skin cancer, likely caused or exacerbated by the constant toxic exposure. But here is what I find most heartbreaking. Many of these women knew they were damaging themselves. This was not ignorance. By the late Victorian era, the dangers of lead and arsenic were well documented. Women who enamelled their faces knew they were taking years off their lives. And they did it anyway, because the alternative, appearing in public with their natural damaged skin, seemed worse than death. Think about the psychology required to make that choice, to look in the mirror every morning, to see the damage you're doing to yourself, and to choose to continue anyway. It speaks to a level of desperation, of feeling trapped, that I think we can barely comprehend today. The painted ladies of Victorian society were often dismissed as vain, foolish, or morally corrupt, but I think they deserve more sympathy than that. They were women navigating an impossible situation, a society that judged them entirely on their appearance, but condemned them for trying to improve that appearance. They were damned if they did, and damned if they did not. As the Victorian era progressed into the Edwardian period and then the early 20th century, the painted look gradually fell out of fashion. Partly this was due to changing beauty ideals, but partly it was because the evidence of harm had become too overwhelming to ignore. And crucially, safer cosmetics were beginning to become available. But the legacy of the painted ladies remains. When you visit a museum and see a Victorian portrait of a woman with eerily white skin, you're not just seeing an artistic choice. You're seeing a document of suffering, a record of the price women paid for beauty in an era that gave them no other currency. And speaking of things that seem beautiful but hide suffering beneath their surface, I need to tell you about a trend so bizarre, so morbid, that it almost defies belief. Because some Victorian women did not just want to look pale and delicate, they wanted to look sick. Specifically, they wanted to emulate the appearance of women dying from one of the most devastating diseases of the era. The romanticization of tuberculosis, the deliberate pursuit of the consumptive look, is a window into Victorian psychology that reveals something profoundly disturbing about how that society viewed women, death, and beauty. And that strange, sad story is unfolding before us now. Of all the strange and disturbing beauty trends we've explored tonight, what I am about to tell you might be the most psychologically revealing. Because this trend was not about applying a product or wearing a garment. This trend was about wanting to have a disease, a deadly, contagious, fatal disease that killed more people in the 19th century than perhaps any other illness. The disease was tuberculosis, though Victorians preferred to call it by a more romantic name, consumption. And somehow, inexplicably, Victorian society decided that dying of consumption made you beautiful. Let me describe the symptoms of tuberculosis to you, and as I do, I want you to think about whether these sound like things anyone would want. Tuberculosis is a bacterial infection that primarily attacks the lungs. It causes a persistent racking cough that produces blood-tinged sputum. Patients experience extreme weight loss, wasting away until they are skeletal. They develop a chronic fever that comes and goes, making them feel alternately burning hot and freezing cold. They sweat profusely at night, soaking through their nightclothes and bedding. They become so weak they can barely walk across a room, and eventually, in most cases, they drown in their own blood as the disease destroys their lungs. This is what tuberculosis actually does. It is a horrific, painful, degrading way to die. And yet Victorian society looked at tubercular patients and said, "How beautiful." Why? What could possibly make people romanticize such a terrible disease? The answer lies in a few specific symptoms that, when viewed through the distorted lens of Victorian beauty standards, could be interpreted as attractive. First, the extreme weight loss. Tuberculosis causes what doctors call wasting, where the body essentially consumes itself, burning through fat and then muscle. Patients become very thin, with prominent collarbones, visible ribs, slender arms and legs. In an era that prized delicacy and fragility in women, this emaciation could be seen as the ultimate expression of feminine frailty. Second, the fever. The chronic low-grade fever of tuberculosis causes flushed cheeks, giving patients a rosy glow that contrasted beautifully with their otherwise pale skin. Remember, pale skin with rosy cheeks was the Victorian ideal. Tuberculosis delivered this look naturally. Third, the brightness of the eyes. For reasons that are not entirely clear, tubercular patients often developed an unusual brightness or glitter to their eyes, possibly due to fever or the dilation of blood vessels. This gave them an almost otherworldly, ethereal appearance, and finally the overall impression of fragility and impending death. There is something about the Victorian mindset that found mortality itself attractive, particularly in young women. The idea of a beautiful young woman slowly fading away, too delicate for this harsh world, became a central theme in Victorian art and literature. The result was something scholars now call consumption chic, or the tubercular look. Women who were perfectly healthy tried to emulate the appearance of those dying from tuberculosis. They would starve themselves to achieve the thin, wasted look. They would use the arsenic and other methods we have already discussed to achieve the pale, almost translucent skin. They would pinch their cheeks or use rouge to create the feverish flush. Some would even use drops to make their eyes appear brighter and more glittering. But here is where things become truly disturbing. Some women went beyond just imitating the look. There are documented accounts, though admittedly not many, of women deliberately exposing themselves to tuberculosis, hoping to contract the disease. Now, before you think this is too absurd to be true, let me put this in context. Tuberculosis was everywhere in Victorian society. It killed roughly 1 in 7 people in Europe and America during the 19th century. Everyone knew someone who had died of consumption. Sanatoriums, special hospitals for tuberculosis patients, were common. The disease was not some distant exotic illness. It was a constant presence, a familiar threat. And Victorian culture had developed a strange relationship with tuberculosis. It was romanticized in literature, in art, in music. The Romantic poets like Keats and Shelley, many of whom died young of tuberculosis, wrote about death and beauty as intertwined concepts. The Bronte sisters, several of whom died of the disease, created heroines who were pale, fragile, and often consumptive. There developed a belief that tuberculosis somehow refined people, that it burned away the coarse and common, leaving only what was pure and beautiful. Artists and intellectuals sometimes spoke of tuberculosis as if it were a mark of sensitivity, of being too fine for this crude world. There was even a theory, completely unfounded, that tuberculosis stimulated creativity and intelligence. So when I tell you that some women deliberately sought exposure to the disease, you have to understand they were living in a culture that had convinced itself tuberculosis was not just tolerable, but perhaps even desirable. They would visit sanatoriums not to help the sick, but to be near them, to breathe the same air. They would use handkerchiefs that had been used by tubercular patients. Some would even, and this is almost too horrifying to state, share cups or utensils with infected individuals. Did many women do this? Probably not. But the fact that any did, the fact that this was even considered a possibility, tells us something profound about how distorted Victorian beauty standards had become. Let me share with you a specific example that illustrates this mindset. There was a famous French actress named Sarah Bernhardt who performed throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. She was known for her dramatic, ethereal beauty and her incredibly thin frame. At one point in her career, rumours circulated that she was dying of consumption, and these rumours actually increased her popularity and her perceived beauty. Men would write her love letters saying how her fragile, dying beauty moved them to tears. The thing is, Bernhardt did not have tuberculosis. She was just naturally very thin. But she did nothing to dispel the rumours, because she understood that the perception of her as consumptive made her more desirable, more romantic, more artistically interesting. She was essentially using the cultural romanticization of tuberculosis as a marketing tool for her career. And it worked. She became one of the most famous actresses of her era, performing well into her 70s. But the fact that pretending to be dying of a horrible disease was good for her career tells you everything you need to know about Victorian attitudes toward beauty, illness, and women. Now, I want to talk about the medical community's response to this romanticization, because it reveals an interesting tension in Victorian society. Doctors were, of course, horrified by the romanticization of tuberculosis. They knew the disease was contagious. They knew it was deadly. They knew that behavior that increased exposure to the disease was dangerous both to individuals and to public health. Medical journals published articles warning against the consumption fad. Doctors gave lectures explaining that there was nothing beautiful or romantic about slowly drowning in your own blood. Some physicians wrote directly to women's magazines, begging them to stop promoting the thin, pale, consumptive look as an ideal. But their warnings had limited effect, for the same reason that warnings about lead, arsenic, mercury and tight lacing had limited effect. Social pressure and cultural ideals were more powerful than medical evidence. There is a fascinating paradox here. Victorian society was obsessed with respectability, with propriety, with following rules. And yet, when those rules conflicted with beauty standards, beauty won almost every time. Women would risk their lives, their health, their very sanity in pursuit of an ideal that their culture had constructed. And here is the truly tragic irony. Many of the symptoms women were trying to emulate, the pale skin, the flushed cheeks, the bright eyes, were exactly the symptoms that the various poisons we have discussed tonight would produce. A woman taking arsenic Wearing lead makeup and tight lacing would naturally develop a look that resembled a tubercular patient, pale from anemia, flushed from fever or toxic reaction, wasted from poor nutrition and digestive problems. So in many cases, women were not just imitating tuberculosis, they were experiencing similar symptoms from their beauty practices and then celebrating those symptoms as attractive. It is almost as if Victorian beauty culture had found a way to commodify and aestheticize suffering itself. Let me read you a quote that captures this mindset perfectly. It comes from a Victorian beauty manual, author unknown, from approximately 1870. The lady of fashion, like the dying consumptive, presents an appearance of interesting delicacy. Her skin is translucent as finest porcelain. Her cheeks bear the roses of fever. Her eyes shine with unnatural brightness. She seems too fine, too pure for this earthly realm, as if she might at any moment ascend to heaven like an angel. Read that again and think about what it is saying. It is comparing a fashionable, healthy woman to someone dying of a terrible disease and framing this as a compliment. It is suggesting that looking like you're about to die is the height of feminine beauty. The psychology behind this is deeply disturbing. Some scholars have suggested that the romanticization of tuberculosis was actually a way for Victorian society to cope with the disease's ubiquity. If everyone you knew was at risk of dying from consumption, if you lived in constant fear of the disease, perhaps making it beautiful was a way of making it less terrifying. If death by tuberculosis could be reframed as poetic, romantic, even desirable, then maybe it was not so frightening after all. But this coping mechanism, if that is indeed what it was, came at a terrible cost. It discouraged people from taking the disease seriously. It made some individuals less careful about exposure, and it created yet another impossible standard for women to live up to. Now they were expected not just to be beautiful, but to be beautifully dying. The tuberculosis aesthetic began to fade in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, partly because medical understanding of the disease improved dramatically. In 1882, Robert Koch identified the tubercle bacillus, the bacteria that causes tuberculosis. This discovery proved definitively that tuberculosis was caused by a microorganism, not by genetics, climate, or spiritual sensitivity. It was contagious, not romantic. This scientific understanding helped strip away some of the mystique. Additionally, public health campaigns began to educate people about how tuberculosis spread and how to prevent it. Sanatoriums became less about romantic retreats and more about quarantine and treatment. The disease was demystified, made mundane and medical rather than poetic and tragic. And perhaps most importantly, as we moved into the 20th century, cultural attitudes began to shift. The Victorian obsession with death and mortality started to seem morbid rather than romantic. New beauty ideals emerged that emphasized health and vitality rather than fragility and illness. The flapper of the 1920s, with her active lifestyle and athletic figure, was the antithesis of the consumptive Victorian beauty. But I want to pause here and acknowledge something. The consumptive look has never entirely gone away. You can see echoes of it in various fashion movements throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The heroin chic look of the 1990s, with models who were extremely thin, pale, and looked almost ill, was essentially a modern version of consumption chic. The contemporary thigh gap obsession, the glorification of extreme thinness, these are the descendants of the Victorian tubercular aesthetic. We like to think we've moved past these dangerous beauty standards, but have we really? Or have we just repackaged them, given them new names, made them slightly less obviously about death and disease? When we celebrate extreme thinness, when we Photoshop away any sign of healthy colour or vitality from models' faces, when we describe the exhausted, underfed look as editorial or high fashion, are we not doing exactly what the Victorians did? Are we not romanticising suffering and calling it beauty? The story of consumption chic is not really about tuberculosis at all. It is about a culture so invested in a particular vision of feminine beauty that it was willing to romanticize death itself to maintain that vision. It is about how beauty standards can become so divorced from reality, so disconnected from health and happiness, that they begin to celebrate their opposites. As we continue our journey through Victorian beauty secrets, I want you to remember the women who starved themselves to look consumptive, who endangered their health to emulate the dying. Because their story is a cautionary tale about what happens when beauty becomes more important than life itself. But while some Victorian women were pursuing the appearance of disease, others were creating their own dangers in more subtle ways, hidden behind closed doors and secret compartments. The underground market of Victorian beauty, the clandestine world of home remedies and illicit cosmetics, was a network of secrecy and shame that reveals yet another dimension of how women navigated impossible standards. That hidden world, with its secret formulas and whispered recommendations, is opening its doors to us now, and what we'll find inside might surprise you. Picture a respectable Victorian lady, perhaps a banker's wife or a merchant's daughter, approaching an apothecary shop on a quiet afternoon. She does not walk through the front door, the one that faces the main street where neighbours might see her. Instead, she slips around to the alley, to a discreet back entrance that the shopkeeper keeps unlocked for precisely this purpose. Inside, away from judging eyes, she whispers her request to the pharmacist, who nods knowingly and retrieves a plain brown package from beneath the counter. No labels, no identifying marks, nothing that could reveal what she has purchased. She pays quickly, hides the package in her reticule, and leaves the way she came. This was not a drug deal, though it might as well have been. This was how respectable women bought cosmetics in Victorian England. Because while society demanded that women be beautiful, it also demanded that they pretend this beauty was entirely natural, God-given, effortless. The contradiction was maddening, and it created an entire underground economy built on secrecy and shame. Welcome to the hidden world of Victorian beauty remedies, where women concocted their own solutions, followed whispered advice passed from mother to daughter, and trusted beauty columnists who wrote under mysterious pseudonyms, dispensing wisdom that was sometimes helpful, sometimes harmless, and sometimes absolutely deadly. Let us start with the advice columns, because these were the primary source of beauty information for most Victorian women. Remember Harper's Bazaar's The Ugly Girl papers, or Hints for the Toilet that we have mentioned before? This was just one of dozens of beauty advice columns that proliferated in women's magazines throughout the Victorian era. These columns had a particular tone that modern readers might find shocking. They were simultaneously judgmental and sympathetic, brutally honest about women's supposed flaws while offering hope for correction. A typical column might begin, "A correspondent writes that she is afflicted with a most unfortunate complexion, rendered sallow and disagreeable by liver spots and freckles. She asks what remedy might restore her to a state fit to appear in polite society." The subtext is clear. Your natural appearance is so defective that you're unfit for society. But do not worry, we have a solution. And then the column would provide a recipe, often involving substances that make your skin crawl. Let me share some actual remedies that were commonly recommended in these columns and beauty manuals, and I want you to listen carefully, because some of these are so bizarre, so potentially dangerous, that you will scarcely believe they were real advice given to real women. For removing wrinkles, one popular remedy suggested applying the juice of a green pineapple to the face. Now, pineapple contains enzymes that do indeed exfoliate skin, so this is not entirely without merit. But green pineapple is extremely acidic, and applying it undiluted to facial skin would cause significant burning and irritation. Imagine the women who tried this, their faces burning, thinking, "This must be working, it hurts so much it must be doing something." For freckles, which were considered absolutely shameful, a disfigurement to be hidden at all costs, one common recommendation was a mixture of lemon juice and horseradish. Again, the acidic properties would indeed lighten skin, but they would also damage it, causing redness, peeling, and potentially permanent scarring. For achieving a rosy complexion, some manuals suggested rubbing one's face with a rough cloth until it was red and inflamed, then applying a mixture of egg white to set the colour. This is just traumatizing your skin and then sealing in the inflammation. The effect would last a few hours at best, and the long-term damage would be considerable. But these relatively innocuous remedies pale in comparison to some of the more extreme suggestions. There was a popular treatment for acne and blemishes that involved applying a poultice of alum mixed with tin ash directly to the affected areas. Alum is a chemical compound that is extremely astringent, and tin ash is essentially metal particles. This mixture could cause chemical burns, and there are documented cases of women dying from the effects of alum poultices on their skin. Then there were the remedies for the eyes. We've already discussed belladonna, but there were other suggestions that were almost as bad. One beauty manual recommended using a mixture of rosewater and antimony to brighten the eyes. Antimony is a toxic metal that was also used in emetics, substances that induce vomiting. Putting it in your eyes could cause severe irritation, vision problems, and systemic poisoning if enough was absorbed. Another eye remedy suggested mixing zinc sulfate with water and using it as eye drops to clear the whites of the eyes and make them more brilliant. Zinc sulfate is a chemical that is indeed still used in some eye products today, but in very specific concentrations and formulations. Victorian women were mixing this at home with no understanding of proper dilution, potentially causing serious eye damage. For the hair, the recommended treatments were equally alarming. One popular formula for promoting hair growth involved rubbing a mixture of pitch, resin, and frankincense into the scalp and eyebrows. Now, pitch is what we use to make road tar. It is thick, sticky, extremely difficult to remove, and when heated and applied to skin can cause burns and allergic reactions. But women were told to heat this mixture and apply it to their scalps, where it would seal in whatever dirt and bacteria were present, creating an ideal environment for infection. Another hair treatment involved washing the hair with a solution of ammonia. Yes, the same ammonia we use for cleaning. The logic was that ammonia would strip away oils and leave the hair clean and shiny. And it did, temporarily. But it also stripped away the natural protective oils that keep hair healthy, leaving it dry, brittle, and prone to breakage. Women using this remedy would find their hair becoming progressively more damaged, so they would use it more frequently, creating another vicious cycle of self-inflicted harm. There were also recommendations for hair dyes, many of which contained lead or mercury. One particularly popular formula suggested mixing lead acetate with sulfur to create a black hair dye. This would indeed darken the hair, but lead absorbed through the scalp can cause systemic lead poisoning, including neurological damage and organ failure. Now I want to talk about the commercial products that were available, because they were often just as dangerous as the home remedies, but with prettier packaging and more convincing marketing. There was a famous establishment in London called Taylor Brothers of Cavendish Square. This was the place to buy beauty products if you were wealthy and fashionable. Their product names were absolutely delightful. Liquid Bloom of Roses for the complexion, Royal Tincture of Peach Kernels for freckles, Carnation of Lilies for skin whitening, and Olympian Dew for bathing the eyes. Do those names not sound lovely? So innocent, so natural, so appealing. But when you look at the actual ingredients, when records of those formulas have survived, you find the same toxic substances we've been discussing all night: lead, arsenic, mercury, all prettily packaged and given names that suggested flowers and fruit rather than poison. The marketing was sophisticated and persuasive. Advertisements would feature testimonials from satisfied customers, though of course there was no way to verify if these testimonials were genuine. They would use aspirational imagery, showing elegant ladies in beautiful settings, implying that using their products would grant you entry to this world of refinement and beauty. Some products made absolutely outrageous claims. One face cream promised to erase all signs of age, returning the complexion of 60 to that of 20 within a fortnight. Another claimed it could permanently remove freckles, moles and scars without pain or inconvenience. These claims were not just exaggerated, they were impossible. But without regulations or consumer protection laws, companies could promise anything. And here is something that might surprise you. Even products that were supposed to be safer alternatives often were not. In the late Victorian era, as awareness of the dangers of heavy metals began to spread, some companies started marketing health cosmetics that claimed to be free of lead, arsenic and mercury. But independent analysis of these products often revealed that they contained the same toxic ingredients as the products they were supposedly replacing. The companies were simply lying. They knew consumers were beginning to demand safer products, so they claimed their products were safe while continuing to use the same old formulas. There was no regulation, no oversight, no consequences for false advertising. Now, let us talk about the do-it-yourself culture that existed alongside these commercial products. Because while some women bought their cosmetics, many more made their own at home, following recipes passed down through families or found in household manuals. There was actually a strong tradition of home cosmetic preparation using natural ingredients, and not all of these were dangerous. Many Victorian household books contained perfectly sensible recipes using ingredients like rosewater, glycerin, cucumber, honey, and beeswax. These natural ingredients could be genuinely beneficial for the skin, and making your own products meant you knew exactly what you were putting on your face. A typical safe recipe might be, for a soothing cream, melt 1 ounce of beeswax with 2 ounces of almond oil. When cooled slightly, add 1 tablespoon of rosewater and stir until smooth. Apply nightly to face and hands. This is actually a perfectly reasonable moisturizer. The beeswax provides a protective barrier, the almond oil moisturizes, and the rosewater adds a pleasant scent and mild astringent properties. A Victorian woman making and using this would suffer no harm and might actually benefit from it. The problem was that these benign recipes existed side by side with dangerous ones, and there was no way for the average woman to distinguish between them. A household book might contain 1 page with the safe rosewater recipe, and the next page with a formula calling for lead or arsenic. They were presented with equal authority, as if they were equally legitimate. And there was a certain class dimension to this as well. Wealthy women could afford to buy expensive commercial products from reputable establishments. Middle-class women might make their own using recipes from books, but poor women often had to make do with the cheapest possible ingredients, which were often the most dangerous. Lead was cheap, arsenic was cheap, safety was expensive, There is something profoundly unjust about a system where the women with the fewest resources were exposed to the greatest dangers. A wealthy woman might use a relatively pure, professionally prepared lead cream. A poor woman might be using a homemade concoction with crude, impure lead that was even more toxic. Both were being poisoned, but the poor woman was being poisoned faster and more severely. I want to share with you one more category of Victorian beauty products that is particularly disturbing: the products marketed to very young girls. Because the pressure to be beautiful started early, sometimes shockingly early. There were beauty products specifically formulated for children, with advertisements showing girls as young as 10 or 12. The marketing would emphasize that it is never too early to begin proper beauty care, that preventing problems was easier than fixing them later, and some of these products designed for children contain the same toxic ingredients as adult cosmetics. Can you imagine putting lead-based face powder on a 10-year-old child? Giving a 12-year-old girl arsenic wafers? These things happened. Parents, usually mothers acting out of misguided love and concern for their daughters' futures, would introduce dangerous beauty practices to children whose bodies were still developing, whose organs were more vulnerable to toxic damage. The long-term effects on these children are impossible to calculate. How many Victorian women who died young of mysterious organ failure were actually suffering from cumulative poisoning that began in childhood? We will never know, because the connections were not made, the dots were not connected. As we approach the final chapters of our journey through Victorian beauty secrets, I want to emphasize the sheer pervasiveness of these dangerous practices. It was not just a few extreme individuals engaging in risky behavior. It was an entire society, an entire culture, systematically poisoning itself in pursuit of an ideal of beauty that was itself toxic. Every layer we have peeled back tonight reveals another dimension of the same fundamental problem. Victorian society created impossible standards for women, gave them very few tools to meet those standards, and then shamed them for trying to use the tools that were available. The respectable lady sneaking through the back door of the apothecary shop, the desperate woman mixing dangerous chemicals in her kitchen, the young girl being given toxic cosmetics by her well-meaning mother, they are all victims of the same system. A system that said, you must be beautiful, but you must pretend it is effortless. You must appear perfect, but you must hide any attempt to achieve that perfection. You must meet impossible standards using dangerous methods, but you must do it in secret and shame. And all of this, all the poisons and procedures, all the pain and risk, were ultimately focused on one goal: making women's bodies conform to a shape and appearance that society had decided was valuable. But there was one part of the body that we've not yet fully explored, one aspect of Victorian beauty that combined vanity, suffering, and spectacular displays of feminine virtue in equal measure. The story of Victorian hair, of the extraordinary lengths women went to achieve the perfect coiffure, will complete our understanding of just how all-encompassing, how totalizing the pursuit of beauty had become. That final piece of the puzzle, with its own secrets and its own tragedies, awaits us now. There exists in museums around the world a peculiar type of Victorian artifact that modern visitors often find both beautiful and slightly unsettling. They are called hair wreaths, elaborate arrangements of flowers and leaves woven entirely from human hair, preserved under glass domes. These wreaths were memorial pieces, created from the hair of deceased loved ones, and they could contain locks from multiple family members, sometimes spanning generations. When scientists in the late 20th century began analyzing these Victorian hair samples, they discovered something shocking. The hair contained extraordinarily high levels of heavy metals, particularly lead, mercury, and arsenic. The hair had absorbed these toxins from the environment these people lived in, from the water they drank, the air they breathed, the cosmetics they used. But it had also absorbed toxins from the products applied directly to the hair itself. Because Victorian hair care was yet another arena where beauty and poison walked hand in hand. In Victorian society, a woman's hair was not just hair. It was a statement of her femininity, her health, her virtue, her very identity. Long, lustrous, abundant hair was considered one of the most important features a woman could possess. There are photographs from the Victorian era showing women whose hair, when unbound, reached past their waists, sometimes all the way to their ankles. Maintaining this much hair, keeping it healthy and beautiful, was a full-time occupation. But length alone was not enough. The hair also needed to be thick, shiny, the right colour, and styled in increasingly elaborate fashions. And achieving all of this required products and practices that were, once again, frequently dangerous. Let us begin with hair colour, because this is where some of the most toxic substances entered the picture. In the early Victorian period, blonde hair was considered most fashionable, associated with youth and innocence. But by the Edwardian era, the preference had shifted to darker hair, particularly rich auburn or chestnut brown shades. Women whose natural hair colour did not match the current fashion faced a choice: accept being considered less attractive, or dye their hair. Hair dyes in the Victorian era were primitive and dangerous. One of the most common formulas for darkening hair involved lead acetate, sometimes called sugar of lead because of its slightly sweet taste. This substance would indeed darken hair gradually with repeated applications. The lead would bind to the protein in the hair shaft, creating a coating that appeared darker. But lead acetate applied to the scalp is absorbed through the skin, and because hair dye requires repeated applications, often weekly or even more frequently, users were experiencing chronic lead exposure. The symptoms would develop slowly: fatigue, headaches, abdominal pain, eventually progressing to more severe neurological symptoms. Many women probably never connected their declining health to their hair dye. There is a medical case study from 1897 documenting a woman who'd been using a lead-based hair dye for approximately 5 years. She developed what doctors called painter's palsy, a form of paralysis affecting the hands and arms that was common among painters who worked with lead-based paints. Her hands would shake uncontrollably, and she eventually lost the ability to grip objects. The doctors treating her initially had no idea what was causing her symptoms until they learned about her hair dye use. But lead was not the only toxic metal used in hair dyes. Some formulas contained silver nitrate for achieving grey or silver tones. Others used bismuth or antimony. And of course, mercury appeared here too, particularly in dyes marketed for covering grey hair. The marketing for these products was remarkably dishonest. Advertisements would show beautiful women with lustrous dark hair, promising that the product was absolutely harmless and derived from purely vegetable sources. The vegetable sources claim was technically true in some cases, as the products might contain plant extracts in addition to the toxic metals, but the implication that they were natural and safe was completely misleading. Now, let us talk about hair loss, because this was a significant concern for Victorian women, and not just because of vanity. Remember, hair was considered such an important aspect of femininity that losing it was seen as almost losing one's identity as a woman. And ironically, many of the beauty practices we've discussed were actually causing hair loss. Lead poisoning causes hair loss. Arsenic poisoning causes hair loss. Mercury poisoning causes hair loss. Tight corsets, by reducing circulation and overall health, can contribute to hair loss. Poor nutrition from trying to achieve the consumptive look causes hair loss. Victorian women were inadvertently creating the very problem they feared most. And what did they do about it? They bought hair growth products, which were often just as toxic as the substances causing the problem in the first place. One popular product claimed to stimulate hair growth through the application of a tincture containing cantharides, which is a substance derived from blister beetles. Yes, beetles. Specifically, beetles that produce a chemical that causes severe skin blistering. The logic was that by irritating the scalp, you would stimulate blood flow and encourage hair growth, and in a way this is not entirely without merit. Modern treatments for hair loss like minoxidil do work partly by increasing blood flow to the scalp. But Victorian cantharides preparations were crude, unregulated, and often far too concentrated. They caused painful blistering, scarring, and in some cases made hair loss worse rather than better. There were also electrical treatments for hair loss, which emerged in the late Victorian period as electricity became more available. Entrepreneurs marketed devices that claimed to stimulate hair growth through electrical current. Some of these were relatively harmless, producing only a mild tingling sensation. Others delivered shocks strong enough to cause burns and tissue damage, and of course, there was no evidence that any of them actually promoted hair growth. But perhaps the most time-consuming aspect of Victorian hair care was the styling, because as the 19th century progressed, hairstyles became increasingly elaborate, requiring hours of work to achieve and maintain. In the 1870s and 1880s, hairstyles reached heights, literally, that seem almost architecturally impossible. Women would build their hair up into towering structures, often incorporating false hairpieces, wire frames, and padding to achieve the desired volume and shape. Some of these styles added 6 or 8 inches to a woman's height. They were heavy, uncomfortable, and required the help of a skilled maid to construct. To hold these elaborate styles in place, Victorian women used a variety of products. Pomades made from animal fats, oils, and waxes were common, but these could turn rancid, particularly in warm weather, creating an unpleasant smell. To mask the odour, women would add heavy perfumes, which often contained their own problematic ingredients. Some women used a substance called bandoline, which was made from quince seeds boiled in water to create a gel-like substance. This was actually one of the safer hair products, as it was genuinely natural and non-toxic. But it was also attractive to insects, which leads us to one of the more disturbing aspects of Victorian hair care. Because these elaborate hairstyles took so long to construct, and because washing and restyling was such an ordeal, women often left their hair styled for days or even weeks at a time. They would sleep carefully, their heads propped on special supports to avoid disturbing their coiffures, and during this time their unwashed hair laden with oils and products would attract lice, fleas, and other parasites. There are accounts, some potentially exaggerated but based in truth, of women finding mice or insects nesting in their hair. The very tall hairstyles of the mid-18th century, which influenced early Victorian styles, were particularly prone to this problem. Women would sometimes insert wire cages into their hairstyles to add height, and these cages could become homes for small creatures. The solution to this problem? Many women would simply not wash their hair for months at a time, instead using dry cleaning methods. They would brush powder through their hair to absorb oils, then brush it out. Or they would use spirits like alcohol to dissolve and remove some of the buildup. But these methods were inadequate, and the cumulative effect was hair that was increasingly damaged and unhealthy. When women did wash their hair, the process was elaborate and the products used were often problematic. One common recommendation was to wash the hair with a solution of ammonia and water. We have mentioned ammonia before, but it is worth reiterating just how harsh this is. Ammonia is alkaline enough to strip not just dirt and oil from hair, but also the natural protective coating that keeps hair healthy. Hair washed repeatedly with ammonia becomes dry, brittle, and prone to breaking. Other hair washing recommendations included using borax, which is slightly less harsh than ammonia but still quite drying, or various types of soap that were often made with lye, another highly alkaline substance. The concept of pH-balanced hair care did not exist yet. Women did not understand that hair and scalp have a slightly acidic natural pH that should be maintained for optimal health. After washing, women would rinse their hair with various concoctions meant to add shine or fragrance. Vinegar rinses were common and actually quite sensible, as the acidity would help restore the hair's natural pH. But other popular rinses included things like sulfur water, which smelled terrible and could cause scalp irritation, or preparations containing lead or silver salts to brighten the hair color. There was also a practice of using heat to style hair, which is still common today but was far more dangerous in the Victorian era. Curling irons were heated over open flames or on stoves, with no temperature control whatsoever. It was entirely possible to heat the iron hot enough to literally burn the hair, causing it to singe, smoke, or even catch fire. There are accounts of women whose hair caught fire from overheated curling irons, sometimes with tragic results. False hair, what we would now call extensions or hairpieces, was extremely common in Victorian society. The hair trade was a significant industry, with hair being sourced from various places, not all of them ethical. Poor women would sell their hair to survive. Hair would be collected from hospitals, from prisons, even from corpses. There were rumours, never fully substantiated but persistent, of hair thieves who would cut hair from sleeping women or from women in crowds. This false hair would be fashioned into switches, braids, and elaborate pieces that could be incorporated into natural hair to add length and volume. But because the sourcing was unregulated, there were concerns about disease transmission. Hair from someone who had died of typhus or cholera might end up being sold as a hairpiece, potentially spreading disease to the purchaser. And here is something that perfectly captures the toxic environment Victorian people lived in. When scientists analyze hair samples from the 19th century, they find heavy metal contamination even in people who did not directly use cosmetics. The air was polluted with industrial emissions containing lead and other metals. The water supply was contaminated. The very plumbing in homes was made of lead. Food was stored in cans sealed with lead solder. Paint on walls contained lead. Victorian people were breathing, drinking, and eating poison every single day, in addition to the poisons they were deliberately applying to their bodies in the name of beauty. Their hair became a record of this exposure, absorbing and retaining these toxins in a way that can still be measured over a century later. There is something both fascinating and deeply sad about those hair wreaths in museums. They were created as memorials, tokens of love and remembrance, but they have become, accidentally, evidence of a society that was poisoning itself. When you look at a Victorian hair wreath, you are not just seeing an artifact of mourning customs. You're seeing physical proof of environmental and cosmetic toxicity on a scale that is hard to comprehend. As we prepare to step back and look at the full picture of Victorian beauty culture, to understand what all of these individual practices add up to, I want you to think about the women who spent hours every day maintaining their hair, who used toxic dyes, harsh washing agents, dangerous heating implements, who incorporated false hair of questionable origin into elaborate styles that they could not even construct without help, who suffered from headaches from the weight of their hairstyles, from scalp problems from the products they used, from systemic poisoning, from the toxins they absorbed. All of this effort, all of this suffering, all of this risk for hair that would be judged by others, evaluated against impossible standards, and found wanting unless it was absolutely perfect. The hair had to be the right colour, the right length, the right texture, styled in the current fashion. Any deviation from the ideal was seen as a fault, a failure, a mark against a woman's value and virtue, and yet, despite all the effort women put into their hair, despite all the products and practices and hours of labour, they were expected to appear as if their beautiful hair was completely natural, effortless, a gift from God rather than the product of daily struggle and toxic chemicals. The same paradox we have seen throughout this journey. You must be perfect, but you must pretend it is natural. You must work constantly at beauty, but you must hide that work. As we move toward understanding the full scope of what Victorian beauty culture meant, what it cost, and why it mattered, we need to pull back and see the larger patterns. Because each individual practice we have examined tonight, each poison and procedure, was part of a larger system. A system that controlled women's bodies, limited their choices, and ultimately served interests that had nothing to do with women's own well-being. That bigger picture, that final synthesis of everything we have learned, is coming into focus now, and understanding it will help us see not just Victorian society, but our own. We have spent hours together tonight exploring individual practices, specific poisons, particular tortures that Victorian women inflicted on themselves in the name of beauty. But now I want to step back with you and ask a larger question, perhaps the most important question of all. Why? Why did this happen? Why did an entire society normalize practices that were so obviously dangerous? Why did women, who were not stupid or ignorant, continue behaviors that they knew were harming them? The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable. Because to truly understand Victorian beauty culture, we need to understand the economic, social, and political systems that created it. We need to talk about power, about who had it and who did not, about who profited from women's desperation, and who paid the price. Let us start with the most fundamental fact. Victorian women had very limited options for economic independence and social security. For the vast majority of women, marriage was not just desirable, it was essential for survival. An unmarried woman, unless she was independently wealthy, faced a life of dependence on male relatives, poverty, or extremely limited employment options. Teaching, governessing, and eventually secretarial work were about the only respectable occupations available to middle-class women, and these positions paid a fraction of what men earned for comparable work. So marriage was not really a choice, it was an economic necessity, and securing a good marriage required being attractive to potential husbands. Beauty was not vanity. Beauty was currency in a marriage market that determined a woman's entire future. Now, think about what this meant. If your financial security, your social standing, your very survival depended on being beautiful enough to attract a suitable husband, how far would you go to achieve that beauty? How much risk would you tolerate? How much pain would you endure? Suddenly, eating arsenic does not seem so irrational, does it? Wearing a corset so tight it deforms your organs starts to make a terrible kind of sense. Putting poison directly into your eyes, painting your face with toxic enamels, all of these practices that seemed insane when viewed individually begin to look like rational, if tragic, responses to an impossible situation. Victorian women were making calculated risk assessments. They were weighing the certain consequences of being considered unattractive, unmarriageable, economically vulnerable, against the uncertain future consequences of using dangerous beauty products. Some of them would be poisoned by their cosmetics, yes, but all of them would suffer if they failed to meet beauty standards. And here is where things get even more insidious. Victorian society did not just create this impossible situation, it also profited from it enormously. The beauty industry in the Victorian era was a massive commercial enterprise. Companies manufacturing cosmetics, corsets, hair dyes, and other beauty products made fortunes. The advertising industry grew partly by selling beauty products. Fashion magazines existed largely on revenue from beauty advertisements. Apothecaries and chemists sold cosmetics at significant markups. The entire economic ecosystem benefited from women's insecurity and desperation. And who owned these companies? Who ran these magazines? Who made the profits? Almost exclusively men. Victorian women had very limited ability to own businesses or control capital. The beauty industry was an industry of men profiting from products sold to women, products that often harmed those women. There is something profoundly cynical about this arrangement. The same society that restricted women's economic opportunities, that made marriage their only real option, that judged them almost entirely on their appearance, also sold them the tools to meet those appearance standards, tools that were frequently dangerous or even deadly. And when women were harmed by these products, they bore the consequences alone. The manufacturers faced no liability, no regulation, no consequences. But the economic exploitation was only part of the story. There was also a moral dimension, a system of judgment and control that kept women trapped in cycles of shame and secrecy. Remember how respectable women had to pretend they were not using cosmetics, how they bought products through back doors and hid them in secret compartments. This was not just about modesty or propriety, this was about control. By making cosmetic use shameful while simultaneously making beauty mandatory, Victorian society ensured that women could never fully satisfy its demands. If you used cosmetics obviously, you were considered vulgar, loose, possibly a prostitute. If you did not use cosmetics and were therefore not beautiful enough, you were considered undesirable, unmarriageable. There was no winning strategy. Women were set up to fail and then blamed for that failure. And this brings us to perhaps the darkest aspect of Victorian beauty culture, the class dimension. Because while wealthy women were using expensive, relatively pure toxic products, working-class women were suffering far more. Think about all the workers we have discussed tonight. The artificial flower makers dying from arsenic exposure, the hatters going mad from mercury, the factory workers manufacturing toxic dyes, the seamstresses sewing arsenic green dresses. These workers were overwhelmingly women, and they were dying so that wealthier women could pursue beauty. There was a literal sacrifice happening here. Working-class bodies were being destroyed to maintain upper-class beauty standards, and Victorian society was perfectly fine with this arrangement. There were occasional outcries when a particularly sympathetic case like Matilda Scheurer came to light. Newspapers would express horror for a few weeks, and then business would continue as usual. Why? Because those working-class lives were not valued the way upper-class lives were. A society woman poisoned by her cosmetics was a tragedy. A factory worker poisoned by manufacturing those cosmetics was just the cost of doing business. And the workers themselves, what choices did they have? They needed the work, they needed the wages, pathetic as they were, to feed their families. So they went to the factories, breathed the toxic fumes, handled the poisonous substances, and died young. They did not have the luxury of refusing dangerous work. Survival required accepting risks that should never have been imposed on anyone. Now, I want to talk about something that might make you uncomfortable: complicity. Because while it is easy to paint Victorian women as victims, and they certainly were victims of a deeply unjust system, it is also true that some of them, particularly wealthy women, were complicit in the suffering of others. When a society lady bought an arsenic green dress, she was creating demand for products that killed the workers who made them. Did she think about those workers? Probably not. Did she care about their suffering? Unlikely. She was too focused on her own needs, her own survival in the marriage market, her own desperate attempt to meet impossible standards. This is how oppressive systems perpetuate themselves. They pit vulnerable groups against each other, making each group's survival contingent on behaviours that harm others. Victorian women were victims of patriarchy, but wealthy Victorian women also perpetuated class oppression. Understanding this complexity is important because it helps us see how these systems work. Now, let us talk about resistance, because it did exist. Throughout the Victorian era, there were women and men who pushed back against dangerous beauty practices. Dress reform movements advocated for healthier clothing. Some doctors risked their reputations by publicly criticising toxic cosmetics. Women writers used their platforms to question beauty standards. But these reform movements faced enormous obstacles. They were fighting against powerful economic interests, entrenched cultural norms, and the desperate individual calculations of millions of women who felt they had no choice but to conform. There is a fascinating paradox here. Many Victorian women knew the beauty standards were harmful. They knew their corsets were damaging their organs. They knew arsenic was poisonous. They knew lead caused neurological damage. But individual knowledge was not enough to change collective behaviour. Because even if you personally decided to reject dangerous beauty practices, you would still be judged by standards that required those practices. You would still be at a disadvantage in the marriage market. You would still be considered less beautiful, less desirable, less valuable. This is what makes systemic problems so difficult to solve. Individual enlightenment is not enough. You need collective action, regulatory change, and fundamental shifts in power structures, and those things are incredibly hard to achieve. So what finally changed? How did Victorian beauty culture eventually transform into something less immediately lethal? The answer involves multiple factors, and understanding them helps us see what is required for real social change. First, there was scientific advancement. The discovery of specific disease-causing organisms like the tuberculosis bacterium helped demystify illness and undermine romantic notions about disease. Better understanding of chemistry and toxicology made it impossible to deny the dangers of heavy metals. Medical imaging, particularly X-rays, provided visual proof of what corsets were doing to women's bodies. Second, there were alternatives. The development of synthetic dyes that did not require arsenic made green clothing less deadly. The invention of safer cosmetic formulations, while still imperfect, reduced the most egregious toxicity. Better materials and designs for undergarments made corsets less necessary. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there were changes in women's social and economic positions. The late Victorian and Edwardian periods saw the beginnings of the women's suffrage movement, increased access to education for women, and gradual expansion of employment opportunities. As women gained more ways to secure their futures beyond marriage, the desperation that drove extreme beauty practices began to ease slightly. World War I was a major turning point. When men went to war, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They worked in factories, drove ambulances, performed physically demanding jobs that were incompatible with tight corsets and elaborate hairstyles. Fashion changed out of necessity, and many women discovered they preferred the freedom of movement and the ability to care for themselves without servants. After the war, many of these changes persisted. The 1920s brought a completely different aesthetic. Shorter skirts, looser clothing, shorter hair, a more athletic ideal of beauty. The flapper represented a rejection of Victorian femininity, though she brought her own problems and pressures. But here is the crucial question, the one we need to sit with as we approach the end of our journey. Have we really moved beyond Victorian beauty culture? Or have we just repackaged it, modernized it, made it slightly less immediately lethal, but no less controlling? Think about what we do today. We inject botulinum toxin, one of the most poisonous substances known, into our faces to remove wrinkles. We undergo plastic surgery, with all its risks, to conform to beauty standards. We develop eating disorders pursuing thinness. We spend hours daily on appearance maintenance. We use products that are not always properly tested for long-term safety. We Photoshop images to impossible standards, creating ideals that literally cannot exist in reality. And the economic dynamics are remarkably similar. The beauty industry today is worth hundreds of billions of dollars globally, still largely controlled by corporations owned and run by men, still profiting from women's insecurities. Social media has added a new dimension, where women are constantly surveilled and judged, where beauty standards can change by the day, where the pressure to be perfect is more pervasive than ever. I'm not saying today is exactly like Victorian times. We have regulations now, consumer protections, better scientific understanding. Women have far more economic and social options than they did in the 1800s. These things matter, they make a real difference. But the fundamental pattern remains. Society creates beauty standards that are difficult or impossible to meet naturally, then sells women products and procedures to help them meet those standards, while simultaneously judging them for trying too hard. Women are still trapped between being criticized for their natural appearance and criticized for the artificiality of their attempts to improve it. And we are still largely blind to the costs paid by others for our beauty. Who makes our cosmetics? Who sews our clothes? Under what conditions? For what wages? Are we thinking about those workers any more than Victorian ladies thought about the arsenic flower makers? Or are we, like them, too focused on our own survival, in our own competitive landscape, to consider the full implications of our choices? These are uncomfortable questions, and I do not have simple answers, but I think they are worth asking, worth sitting with, worth taking seriously. Because understanding the past is not just about knowing what happened, it is about recognizing patterns that continue, systems that persist, and choices that remain available to us. The Victorian beauties we've met tonight were not monsters. They were not even particularly vain. They were women navigating an impossible situation as best they could, making rational choices within an irrational system. Some of them died for those choices. Many more suffered. All of them, in some way, paid a price for beauty that no one should have to pay. And as we prepare to close this journey, to bring all of these stories and lessons together into a final understanding, I want you to think about what we owe to these women. Not pity, I think. Pity is condescending. But perhaps recognition, respect, and a commitment to learning from their experiences, a commitment to questioning the beauty standards of our own time, to resisting systems that profit from our insecurities, to building a world where women's value is not determined by their appearance. That vision, that possibility of something better, is what our final chapter holds. Because after exploring all the darkness, all the poison and pain and desperation, we need to ask, what now? What do we do with this knowledge? How do we honor these women's suffering by building something different, something better? Those questions and the hope they contain are waiting for us just ahead. We have travelled through a long night together, you and I, exploring rooms filled with poison and secrets, meeting women who paid terrible prices for beauty. And now, as our journey approaches its end, I want to bring us back to where we started. That Victorian lady sitting at her dressing table, reaching for jars and bottles that might kill her, making choices that seem incomprehensible until you understand the world she lived in. But I also want to bring us forward, to our own time, to our own mirrors, to our own choices, because the legacy of Victorian beauty is not just history, it is alive, present, shaping our world in ways we might not even recognize. Let me tell you what happened after the Victorian era ended, how these dangerous practices finally began to fade, and what lessons we can draw from that transformation. The first major shift came with regulation. In 1906, the United States passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was primarily focused on food and medicine, but also began to address cosmetics. It was not comprehensive, not nearly strict enough, but it was a start. It established the principle that the government had a role in protecting consumers from dangerous products. In 1938, the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act significantly expanded these protections. This law was passed partly in response to a tragedy involving a product called Lash Lure, an eyelash and eyebrow dye that caused severe reactions, including blindness and at least one death. Public outcry over this incident finally created enough political will to impose real regulations on the cosmetics industry. Similar laws were passed in Britain and other European countries around the same time. Slowly, painfully slowly, governments began to accept responsibility for protecting citizens from dangerous products. Lead, arsenic and mercury were gradually banned from cosmetics. Testing requirements were introduced. Labeling laws were implemented. This regulatory framework is why you can go to a store today and buy makeup without serious fear that it will poison you. It is not perfect. There are still concerns about certain ingredients, but it is vastly better than the unregulated chaos of Victorian times. And it happened because people, mostly women, demanded it. They organized, they lobbied, they refused to accept that being poisoned was just the price of beauty. This is the first lesson. Change requires collective action and government regulation. Individual choices matter, but they are not enough. Systems need to change, and that requires political will and legal frameworks. The second major shift was economic. As women gained more access to education and employment, as they acquired more legal rights and social freedoms, marriage became less of an economic necessity and more of a personal choice. This did not happen overnight. It is still happening, unevenly, incompletely. But the trajectory is clear. As women's economic options expanded, their desperation to meet beauty standards at any cost diminished. When you have other ways to secure your future, when your survival does not depend entirely on being attractive to a husband, you can afford to be more selective about the risks you take with beauty practices. You can say no to things that harm you. You have that luxury. This is the second lesson. Women's liberation and women's health are intimately connected. Economic independence gives you the freedom to prioritize your well-being over impossible standards. The third shift was scientific and medical. As understanding of chemistry, biology, and toxicology improved, it became impossible to deny what these substances were doing to people's bodies. X-ray images of corseted rib cages, chemical analyses of arsenic-contaminated hair, medical documentation of mercury poisoning, all of this evidence accumulated until it could not be ignored. But here is the important part. The evidence alone was not enough. The medical community had been warning about these dangers for decades before anything changed. Evidence only matters when there is social and political will to act on it. Knowledge is necessary but not sufficient. This is the third lesson. We need science, but we also need to listen to science, and that requires overcoming powerful interests that profit from the status quo. Now, let us talk about what all of this means for us today, because I promised you that understanding Victorian beauty would help us understand our own time, and I want to make good on that promise. The beauty industry today is worth approximately $500 billion globally. Think about that number, $500 billion. That is more than the gross domestic product of most countries. This industry has immense economic and cultural power, and it uses that power to shape beauty standards, to create insecurities, and to sell us solutions to problems it has helped create. And just like in Victorian times, the costs are unevenly distributed. The women working in cosmetics factories in developing countries, exposed to chemicals without adequate protection. The children mining mica for makeup, risking their lives in illegal mines. The models and influencers developing eating disorders to maintain impossible standards. The consumers spending money they cannot afford on products they do not need, trying to fix flaws that exist only in comparison to photoshopped images. The mechanisms have changed, but the pattern is remarkably similar. Create standards that are difficult to meet. Make women feel inadequate for failing to meet them. Sell products and procedures that promise to bridge the gap. Profit from the cycle of insecurity and consumption. So what do? How do we break this pattern? I do not have all the answers, but I have some thoughts, some suggestions based on everything we have learned tonight. First, we need to recognize that beauty standards are constructed, not natural. The things we consider beautiful today are different from what the Victorians considered beautiful, which was different from what the ancient Romans considered beautiful, which will be different from what people 100 years from now consider beautiful. Beauty is cultural, historical, changeable. Recognizing this can help us resist the tyranny of current standards. Second, we need to question who benefits from our insecurities. When you see an advertisement that makes you feel bad about yourself, ask, who profits from me feeling this way? When you read an article about a new beauty trend you must follow, ask, who is selling something here? Developing this critical awareness is a form of resistance. Third, we need to support regulation and oversight of the beauty industry. Push for transparent labeling, for safety testing, for restrictions on false advertising. Vote for politicians who take consumer protections seriously. Support organizations working to improve conditions for beauty industry workers. Use your economic and political power to demand better. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, we need to redefine what we value in ourselves and others. As long as appearance is the primary way we judge women's worth, as long as beauty is the most important currency women can possess, we will continue to see exploitation and harm. We need to expand our definitions of value to celebrate intelligence, kindness, creativity, strength, resilience, all the qualities that actually matter in life. This is not about rejecting beauty or saying that appearance does not matter at all. Beauty can be joyful, creative, a form of self-expression. The problem is not beauty itself, but systems that make beauty mandatory, that punish women for failing to meet arbitrary standards, that profit from women's suffering. Let me tell you something I have realized in researching this topic. The Victorian women we have met tonight were not so different from us. They were smart, capable, doing their best in difficult circumstances. They made choices that seem strange to us now, but we make choices that will probably seem strange to people a century from now. The question is, what do we want those future people to say about us? Do we want them to look back with the same mixture of pity and incomprehension that we feel toward Victorian women? Or do we want them to see us as the generation that started to change things, that began to break these destructive patterns? I think about Matilda Schurer, the 19-year-old artificial flower maker who died with green vomit spilling from her mouth, poisoned by arsenic in the flowers she made for wealthy women's hats. I think about the unnamed hatters who lost their minds to mercury, about the women who went blind from belladonna, about Mrs. Grieve with her crushed rib cage, about all the countless women whose names we do not know, who suffered and died in pursuit of beauty that was never worth that price. What do we owe these women? I think we owe them remembrance, yes, but more than that, we owe them wisdom. We owe them the commitment to learn from their suffering, to not repeat their mistakes, to build a world where women's bodies are not battlegrounds and beauty is not a form of slow suicide. And I think we owe them the recognition that they were doing the best they could with the options available to them. They were not vain or foolish. They were trapped in systems they did not create and could not escape. Just as we are trapped in our own systems, our own impossible standards, our own cycles of insecurity and consumption. But here is the thing about being trapped. Recognizing the trap is the first step toward escaping it. Understanding how these systems work, seeing the patterns clearly, that knowledge is power. It does not automatically free us, but it gives us the tools to start building our own freedom. As I close this journey with you, I want to leave you with one final thought. Beauty is not the enemy. The enemy is a system that weaponizes beauty, that uses our desire to feel attractive, to feel valued, to feel worthy, and turns it into a tool of control and profit. The enemy is the lie that there is one right way to look, one correct body, one acceptable face. The enemy is the belief that women's primary value lies in their appearance. Victorian women fought this enemy with the tools they had, limited as those tools were. Some of them died fighting, many more suffered. But they also, in small ways, resisted. They whispered warnings to each other. They wrote articles questioning dangerous practices. They organized reform movements. They survived as best they could, and they passed their wisdom down to daughters who would have slightly more freedom, slightly more options, slightly more power. We inherit that ongoing struggle. We benefit from the battles they fought, and we have a responsibility to continue that work, to fight for a world where no woman has to choose between beauty and health, between conformity and survival, between acceptance and poison. The Victorian beauties who hid dangerous secrets are not just historical curiosities. They are our ancestors, our teachers, our warnings. Their secrets are no longer hidden. We have brought them into the light, examined them, understood them. Now we must decide what to do with that understanding. I hope you will carry these stories with you. I hope you will think about them when you look in the mirror, when you scroll through social media, when you feel inadequate or flawed or not beautiful enough. I hope you will remember that beauty standards are constructed by people with agendas, that they change with time, that they are not worth dying for. And I hope you will be gentle with yourself and with other women navigating these same impossible pressures. We are all doing our best. We are all worthy of respect and dignity regardless of how we look. Our value does not depend on our appearance. Our worth is inherent, unchangeable, ours by right of being human. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. Thank you for having the courage to look at these difficult truths, to sit with discomfort, to think critically about systems that often remain invisible. Thank you for your time, your attention, your willingness to learn. As you drift towards sleep, as you let these stories settle into your mind, I hope you find peace. Peace with your own reflection, peace with your choices, peace with the knowledge that you are enough, exactly as you are. The Victorian women we met tonight did not have that peace, but we can claim it for ourselves and in doing so honour their memory. Sleep well wherever you are. Dream of a world where beauty and health are not enemies, where women are valued for all that they are, where the secrets we keep are joyful rather than dangerous. That world is possible. It begins with awareness, with questioning, with refusing to accept what has always been. And when you wake, I hope you will carry forward what we've learned here, not as a burden, but as a gift. The gift of understanding, of perspective, of freedom from the tyranny of impossible standards. Until we meet again, until the next story calls us into the night, take care of yourself. Be kind to yourself. Remember that you are part of a long lineage of women who have survived impossible expectations, and that lineage continues through you toward a future that we are building together, one choice at a time. Good night, my friends. Thank you for sharing this night with me. I will see you in the next journey, where new stories await, new lessons to learn, new understanding to gain. But for now, rest. You have earned it.